3 shipwrecks. Same place. Years apart. One survivor each time. Same name. Hugh Williams. Welcome to the strangest coincidence no one asked for. A story so bizarre it stretches the very fabric of what we believe about randomness, about history, about the odds of lightning striking the same soul not twice, but 3 times. The years were 1664, 1785, and 1820. All 3 ships went down in the treacherous waters of the Menai Strait, a narrow and often cruel body of water off the coast of Wales. And from each wreck, amid the splintered wood and drowned lives, a single man emerged alive. A man named Hugh Williams, not a sailor with extraordinary skills, not a nobleman with divine protection, just Hugh Williams, again and again. There are no hidden clues, no neat explanations tucked away in dusty records. The details are sparse, shadowy even, as if the truth itself recoiled from being written down. And maybe that's part of why this story lingers. It offers no comfort, no sense of order, just a quiet absurdity that doesn't make sense no matter how many times you tell it. You could say it's all coincidence, a fluke, a trick of statistics. But say it out loud, and it sounds like an insult to the universe's imagination. 3 identical names, 3 identical fates reversed at the edge of death. If this is randomness, then randomness has a flair for narrative. And if it's not randomness, then what exactly are we looking at? Perhaps Hugh Williams wasn't a person, but a name passed down like a secret, like a life jacket sewn into a bloodline. Or perhaps it was the same man somehow. Maybe time folds in ways we don't understand. Or the sea keeps giving him back like a coin it refuses to swallow. It's easier to laugh at the story than to accept how unsettling it is. Because deep down, we want the world to follow rules. And Hugh Williams doesn't. There's something haunting about it, not in a horror movie kind of way, but in the quiet realization that we may not understand everything we think we do. The logic doesn't work here. This isn't science or myth. It's just a record of what happened, and the unsettling silence that follows every time someone reads it. Maybe Hugh Williams was lucky, or cursed, or maybe he never existed at all, and this is just a story the sea tells itself on stormy nights. But the names are there, the dates are real, and the pattern refuses to fade. And in a world that often pretends to be logical, nothing is more unnerving than a pattern that has no reason to exist. So we're left with that impossible image, wreckage, storm, the scream of timbers snapping, and one man crawling from the surf, coughing up seawater and carrying a name that should have drowned centuries ago. Is it fate, a glitch in the simulation, or just some guy who refuses to die? Nobody knows. All we know is, his name was Hugh Williams, and he lived, again, and again, and again. And if that sounds like fiction, like something pulled from the brittle pages of a forgotten novel, then it's time we step into the waters themselves, cold, violent, and far too real. You've heard the outline, but the devil, as always, lives in the details, and the sea keeps its devils close. The year was 1664, long before the sea charts were more than educated guesses, and a ship, its name now lost to history, swallowed by the tide, set out across the Menai Strait. The weather turned, as it often does in that narrow Welsh corridor, the sky collapsing into thunder, the waves pulling at the hull with the fury of a god cheated. The ship went down in the chaos, wood snapping, sails torn to ribbons, the screams of the drowning stifled by salt and foam. When it was over, and the storm had passed like a judgment fulfilled, only one man was found alive, drifting in silence: Hugh Williams. Over a century later, in 1785, another vessel, a smaller ship this time, likely a merchant or a fishing craft, set out into those same waters. The strait, deceptively calm at times, had its moods, and that day it chose to be cruel. The wind shifted with no warning, smashing the craft against rocks that waited beneath the surface like teeth in a smile. The boat split, rolled, and sank. Fishermen on the shore spoke of hearing the wood groan like it was crying out. And again, just one man crawled out of the wreckage, salt-streaked and half-blind. His name was Hugh Williams. No explanation, no connection to the last one. Just the same name, alive again. Then came 1820. By then, ships had changed, grown stronger, supposedly safer. But the sea doesn't care how well you build your walls. It only cares when and how to bring them down. Another wreck, same strait, same doom waiting just beneath the gray-green waves. Accounts from the time speak of sudden fog, disorientation, something eerie, like the strait itself reached up and pulled the vessel under. Once more, the crew was lost, the sea closing over their heads like a curtain. And when it parted again, like some cruel stage play repeated once too often, only one survivor emerged, a man, soaked, shivering, clinging to driftwood with a grip like death itself. His name, again, was Hugh Williams. No connection between these men has ever been found. No shared lineage. No blood passed down knowingly. If they were related, time has erased the lines that bound them. If they were not, then something more disturbing might be at work. Each event documented, not in myth or bedtime story but in local reports, in whispers passed from sailors who know that coincidences like these don't sit right with the soul. So you're left not with answers, but with the scent of salt in your lungs and a chill that runs deeper than the water. Because somewhere, out there, in the churn of history and sea, 3 men bearing the same name survived when no one else did. And the silence that follows that fact is the kind that doesn't leave you alone. And once you've let the eerie quiet settle in, once the waves in your imagination stop crashing, you start to ask the only question left. How? Not spiritually, not narratively, just logistically, mathematically, sensibly. Because no matter how romantic or haunting the tale may be, the numbers behind it simply don't line up. How many men named Hugh Williams were just casually loitering near ships on the verge of catastrophe? Like moths to a flame they somehow always outrun. Was there a How Not to Die at Sea club in the 17th and 18th centuries, and Hugh Williams was the only guy who remembered to bring a life preserver? You look at the sheer absurdity of it, and your brain starts trying to fix it. Add a footnote, find a typo in the timeline, convince yourself there must be some mix-up in the archives. But the records, as bare and uncooperative as they are, just keep repeating that same impossible name. Now maybe the answer's less supernatural and more sociological. In Wales, especially during those centuries, Hugh Williams wasn't exactly a rare moniker. Hugh, a name with roots in Old Germanic for heart, mind, or spirit. Williams, a patronymic surname, son of William. Together, they form something not quite as ubiquitous as John Smith, but common enough that the repetition could, if you squint and pray for logic, begin to make some sense. You might have had dozens, maybe hundreds, of Hugh Williamses walking around coastal towns over the span of those years. Enough that 1 or 2 being near tragedy isn't as ludicrous as it first seems. Still, 3 shipwrecks, 3 survivors. And 3 times, the same name rises to the surface like a bad joke with no punchline. Some have speculated that it wasn't a person at all, but a name used like a title, passed through generations like a lucky charm or a curse. Others wondered whether it might have been an alias, the sort of name a man on the run might give when he wanted the past to stay drowned. And then, of course, there's the weirder thought, the one that arrives late at night when you're too tired to argue with it. What if Hugh Williams was never a man, but a placeholder? A label the universe sticks on anomalies it can't explain. A simulation tag, slipped in like a variable that forgot how to stay random. You can try to dig through census records, parish documents, naval rosters, and you'll find plenty of men named Hugh Williams. Miners, farmers, soldiers, sons. But you want to find a pattern that explains why this particular name keeps getting plucked out of watery death like a thread the universe refuses to cut. It's a name that should be meaningless, should be statistical dust, and yet it keeps echoing through the wreckage. And in the end, you're left with a name not remarkable on its own, not noble or mystical or rare, but somehow too persistent, too alive, too consistent across centuries of chance, which, in a world that prides itself on order and reason, might be the most unsettling part of all. And once you've worn out the facts and worn down the paper trail, your mind starts reaching elsewhere. Not because you're gullible, but because sometimes the official version of things just doesn't satisfy the soul. The story lingers precisely because it doesn't behave, and when logic packs up and leaves, speculation moves in with a suitcase full of wild ideas and no intention of being reasonable. What if Hugh Williams wasn't just lucky, but unstuck in time, looping through shipwrecks like some poor soul trying to fix history one sinking at a time, always too late, always the last one standing? Or maybe he was immortal, doomed not to roam the earth in glory, but to keep waking up in damp clothes, coughing seawater, destined to watch every ship he's on fall apart around him. You start to wonder if he even knew, if, deep down, the name Hugh Williams carried a weight no one else could feel. A curse, maybe. Not the kind that dooms you to die, but the kind that makes sure you never quite do. Then there are the stranger roads your mind takes in the quiet hours. The idea that the Hugh Williams we keep hearing about might not be from here at all. What if, across parallel universes, there are thousands of Hugh Williamses, and every now and then, one slips through, wakes up on a ship not meant for him, and somehow survives it anyway? Or maybe we're living in a simulation, and the programmers just got lazy with their non-playable characters. Hugh Williams, default survivor. Run him 3 times, leave the rest to glitch. But eventually, the wind dies down, the fog clears, and you find yourself back where you started, on the dry land of reason, asking the old questions again. Because maybe there's no need for alternate timelines or immortal sailors. Records from the 1600s weren't exactly airtight. Shipwrecks were chaotic, messy, and rarely documented with precision. One name might have survived not because he was the only one, but because his name happened to be the one written down. Memory is a fragile thing, and paper even more so. Folklore doesn't need much to catch fire. A strange coincidence, a shared name, a handful of witnesses, and suddenly what was once an odd event becomes legend. People retell it, polish it, add salt and shadow to it with every new voice, until the story becomes what we needed it to be, not what it actually was. That's the way stories work. They don't just record our past, they reshape it, stretch it into something more meaningful, more haunting, more human. And so maybe there wasn't just one survivor. Maybe there were several, but only one with a name that could carry the weight of myth. Maybe the name Hugh Williams wasn't special at all, until the story made it so. And in a way, that might be the most human part of all. Not the coincidences, not the superstitions, but the way we take the inexplicable and turn it into something worth remembering. And once the story has settled into your bones, you can't help but turn to the place itself. Because if names carry echoes, then so does the land. And the Menai Strait has been whispering long before any Hugh Williams ever set foot near it. Stretching between the island of Anglesey and the mainland of Wales, it's a narrow ribbon of water that looks deceptively calm in the light, like a mirror hiding something underneath. But that strait is no gentle stream. Its currents twist and surge with a mind of their own, tugged by some of the most complex tidal patterns in all of Britain. Twice a day, the sea rushes in and out through that narrow channel, squeezing through rocks and sandbanks, dragging debris and sailors along with it. To sail it is to flirt with disaster, especially when fog descends and the wind turns cruel. Conditions that are never rare in that part of the world. The rocks just beneath the surface are jagged, unmarked, and waiting. Some lie hidden just beneath the waterline like traps laid by time itself, while others shift over generations, as if trying to rewrite the map in secret. Boats that misjudge by even a few feet can be ripped open like fruit. The strait has swallowed more vessels than it has spared, and the bottom is littered with the bones of ships that never saw land again. Even with modern navigation, it's not a place to take lightly. Back then, with charts hand-drawn and guesses masquerading as knowledge, it was closer to a game of chance. One miscalculation, one gust in the wrong direction, and your ship could be dashed against the very rocks you thought you were avoiding. The sea narrowed there, and so did your odds of making it through. There's something about the Menai Strait that feels ancient, like it remembers. It holds the stories of fishermen and smugglers, of merchants and naval men, of the drowned and the nearly so. It's not just a place where ships sank. It's a place that demanded they do. A quiet kind of menace, not loud or explosive, but always there, waiting. And maybe that's why this story chose that place. Because if a legend was going to be born anywhere, it would be where the sea still makes its own rules. And after the sea has gone quiet again, after the maps are rolled back up and the legends tucked away in their dusty corners, something curious happens. This old tale refuses to stay buried. It drifts, not through water this time, but through wires and screens, bubbling up on forums, trivia lists, and eerie YouTube videos narrated by voices that try to make the past sound like a horror movie trailer. The story of Hugh Williams has found its way into that strange space we all live in now, where myth and meme blur together. You'll see it sandwiched between UFO sightings and spontaneous combustion, dressed up in glitchy text on TikTok or dropped casually into a list called Top 10 Coincidences That Will Make You Question Reality. Someone always tells it like they just discovered it, like they've cracked some great cosmic riddle that history forgot to explain. And of course, it's only a matter of time before it becomes a joke in its own right. You'll see the comment beneath a news story about a lone survivor, someone typing, "Let me guess, Hugh Williams?" It's got that strange meme potential. Catchy, weird, and just plausible enough to live forever online. Survivor? Must be Hugh Williams. At this point, the names become shorthand for the impossible, a punchline for fate itself. But even as it turns lighthearted, the story still hums underneath with that old unease. Because the more it gets shared, the more people stumble over it for the first time, wide-eyed and quiet for a moment, wondering if it could really be true. And that's the thing about stories like this. They survive not because they're real, but because they make us feel like the world might be deeper than the headlines let on. They remind us that mystery still has a place, even in a world that pretends it's figured everything out. And so, Hugh Williams sails again, not on the sea, but across Wi-Fi and screens, passed from one curious mind to another. A name lost to shipwrecks, now living as trivia, folklore, and sometimes even prophecy in the strangest corners of the internet. And as the story keeps echoing through the internet's halls of curiosity, you might begin to wonder, was it just those 3 shipwrecks? Or is the name Hugh Williams cursed to flirt with the strange no matter where it appears? You start to dig, just out of idle fascination, and you find that the name pops up more than you'd expect, scattered across time like a breadcrumb trail for the curious. There was a Hugh Williams who served in Parliament, another who acted on stage and screen, and yet another who was a baronet, carrying the name with an air of aristocracy. None of them are linked to shipwrecks, but there is still a weird consistency in how the name shows up, like it is always within arm's reach of some small oddity, a whisper of drama, a footnote that doesn't quite belong. One was known for ghost stories, another died young under unusual circumstances, and a third had a gravestone that seems to have been relocated more than once, as if even in death the name won't sit still. It may be nothing, of course. These are small threads, scattered too widely to form a real pattern. But that's how stories like this work, isn't it? They invite you to see the shape even when there isn't one. They let your mind connect the dots in the shadows until coincidence starts wearing the clothes of destiny. And once you notice the name, you start spotting it in places it has no business being, like it is following you instead of the other way around. So in the end, what do we make of it? Was it just a name shared by many and remembered by chance? Or was it something else entirely? A soul passing through time, always finding its way to the edge of the abyss but never falling in. Is Hugh Williams still out there? Maybe under a different name? Maybe at the ticket counter of a cruise line, politely declining the window seat. We won't know, of course. That is the curse and the beauty of stories like this. They don't tie themselves up with answers. They linger, quiet and unsettling, like the sound of water moving beneath a wooden hull in the dark. And just when you think you've put it out of your mind, you'll hear the name again, Hugh Williams, and wonder for just a second what the ocean still remembers. It begins in the frost-bitten silence of a Norwegian valley, a place the locals had long ago nicknamed Death Valley. Not for superstition, but for the strange and somber history it seemed to collect like mist between the pines. Isdal, the ice valley, crouches in the cold shadow of Bergen, its trails rarely traveled in the dead of winter. It was here, in late November of 1970, that a lone hiker, making his way through the frozen terrain with his 2 young daughters, stumbled upon something his mind would never unsee. What he found wasn't just a body. It was a question mark carved in flesh and fire. A woman, scorched nearly beyond recognition, lay nestled among the rocks as if placed there by some unseen hand. Her arms curled close to her chest, fingers clawed and clenched tight as if she had tried to hold on to something that would not let her go. The smell of burnt hair and flesh lingered on the air. And yet, what caught investigators' eyes was not just the death, it was the arrangement. There was a strange, almost deliberate stillness to how she lay, as though someone had staged a story and dared the world to interpret it. There were objects placed near her. Jewelry laid beside her body, not worn. A sleeping bag partially burned. Scattered around her were personal belongings, all curiously stripped of identity. Labels torn off, brand names carefully removed. There was no passport, no identification, no clue to say who this woman had been. In a place already etched in dark folklore, the police found themselves staring at something far stranger than a tragic suicide or a winter accident. The woman had not died quickly. Forensics would later reveal soot in her lungs. She had still been breathing when the fire consumed her. There were sleeping pills in her stomach, enough to blur the edges of awareness, but not enough to end her life. And then came the quiet horror. Her fingerprints had been filed down, deliberately altered, as though even in death she was not allowed to speak her name. And yet she had been someone. There were traces of a life woven into the mystery. At the Bergen railway station, 2 suitcases had been left behind. Inside them, investigators found a curious collage of identities and intentions. Wigs of different lengths and colors, eyeglasses without prescription lenses, cosmetics, clothing with every tag removed. There were multiple currencies from different countries, and a notepad scribbled with what appeared to be codes, abbreviated locations and times, possibly travel records, but nothing that immediately made sense. There were no personal letters, no family photographs, nothing that connected her to another human soul. It was as if she had been living not as a person, but as a shadow, an echo that moved from city to city, hotel to hotel, always one step ahead of being known. Police soon learned she had signed into hotels under at least 8 different aliases. Names like Alexia Zarna Merches, Vera Schlossneck, and Jennifer Fairgate, each one like a mask, each one a whisper of something carefully constructed. She had traveled widely, through Paris, Milan, Hamburg, Oslo. Hotel staff recalled her as refined, aloof, always calm. She spoke multiple languages, always seemed to know when to leave. She often changed rooms without warning, always paid in cash, and never let anyone too close. Sometimes she wore wigs. Sometimes she simply vanished. She moved like someone who knew she was being watched, and perhaps someone who had spent her life watching in return. The timing of it all cast a long Cold War shadow over the case. Norway, in 1970, stood as a critical point of interest for NATO. There were military tests, missile installations, places that would have drawn the attention of rival powers. Some of the hotels the woman had visited were within striking distance of such locations. Her pattern of movement, her use of false identities, her calculated detachment, they all mirrored known behaviors of intelligence operatives from both sides of the Iron Curtain. And yet there was no official confirmation, no agency willing to claim her, no adversary stepping forward to admit she had been theirs. If she was a spy, she had either gone rogue or become expendable. Her death, violent and theatrical, bore no fingerprints of justice, only the cold indifference of utility lost. Witnesses did remember her, though. A few who crossed paths with her spoke of a woman who never quite settled. She kept to herself, always alert. One person claimed to have seen her speaking to a man in a military-style trench coat shortly before she disappeared. Others noticed how she never made eye contact, how she drifted through Bergen as though she were being followed, or perhaps chasing something herself. No one could say for certain, but the image of her, elegant and unknowable, stuck in the minds of many. Whatever she had not been ordinary. Still, despite the signs and signals pointing toward foul play, the official ruling came with a kind of bureaucratic shrug. Suicide. That was the final word on the report. As if a woman had meticulously erased her identity, taken sleeping pills, carried herself into the woods, doused herself in accelerant, and then, without a lighter or match ever found, set herself ablaze. It never quite sat right. It was the kind of conclusion that sounds like closure on paper, but feels like silence in your gut. Years passed, but the mystery never quite let go of the public imagination. Decades later, journalists and investigators returned to the case, unwilling to let it remain buried in cold archives. In 2016, a podcast called Death in Ice Valley brought new attention to the Isdal woman, gathering witness accounts, public speculation, and forensic reevaluations. By 2020, Advances in DNA phenotyping suggested she may have originated from somewhere in Central Europe, perhaps Germany, France, or Luxembourg. But even with modern science scraping the depths of her genetic code, there were no matches. No family stepped forward. No photograph surfaced from some forgotten archive. She remained still, a blank page with traces of ink. People began to wonder if she had been killed by the very agency that trained her. Or perhaps she was a courier for the kind of underworld dealings that thrive beneath the surface of Europe's glittering cities. Some thought she had been part of something larger, something dangerous, and had finally run out of time. Others believed she had simply wanted to vanish. Maybe the aliases weren't about espionage at all, but about pain. A woman running from something so deep, so personal, that even death seemed preferable to recognition. Perhaps she was never trying to be found. And yet, even in that theory, one is left with the unsettling image of her final moment. Alone. Breathing fire. Surrounded by clues, yet screaming nothing. In the end, what we are left with is not a resolution, but an absence that echoes. A woman without a face, a voice lost to time. Who was she running from? Who watched her last? And how does someone burn to death in a forest, surrounded by so many fragments of a life, and yet leave behind no truth? Half a century later, the Isdal woman is not just a cold case. She is a shadow burned into history, a silent witness to the secrets of an era, forever beyond our reach. And so the curtain had only just risen on a story far stranger than fiction, where the prologue was a lifeless figure smoldering in solitude, and the chapters ahead would only spiral deeper into silence and contradiction. After that grim discovery in the Cold Valley, the events of November 29, 1970, began to unfold, not as a straightforward tragedy, but as a riddle left in ash and embers. A man out walking with his daughters near Bergen's remote and icy terrain stumbled upon what no father ever expects to find. A human body, blackened by fire, lying amidst a bed of jagged rocks, just slightly off the footpath that snaked through the hollowed-out hills of Isdal. It was early winter, and the forest carried a biting stillness, the kind that makes you feel like the trees themselves are watching. There wasn't much noise in the valley that day, save for the distant rustle of wind slicing through bare branches. But the silence didn't stay quiet for long. The stench of burnt flesh had already begun to settle into the mossy ground, and there was something about the way the woman lay that unsettled even the most hardened first responders. Her body was charred almost beyond recognition, but the details that remained, those told an altogether different story. Her arms were curled inwards, clenched at the chest, not stretched out as one would expect from someone unconscious during an inferno. The muscles had seized as if in pain, her final moments frozen mid-defiance, and it was this small but horrifying detail that whispered the first truth. She had been alive when the flames reached her. Around her, scattered like remnants of a vanished life, were everyday items: a watch, a bottle, half-melted remnants of food containers, and fragments of clothing. But not a single one bore a label. Everything that might have told someone who she was had been carefully removed, as if by a hand intent on erasing every trace of memory she might have left behind. Even the objects that survived were stripped bare, like her, intentionally anonymized, systematically emptied of context. Investigators didn't find a wallet, no papers, no identification. Just the outline of a person where a life used to be. At first glance, some officers wondered if they were looking at a suicide. Perhaps a woman burdened by something too heavy to carry had walked into the wild to disappear, staging her own erasure in the quietest place she could find. But the longer they looked, the more the scene resisted such an explanation. There was no nearby fire starter, no match, no lighter, nothing to ignite such a blaze. The area wasn't scorched enough to suggest a wild spread of flames, meaning the fire had been focused solely on her, as if lit with purpose, and then extinguished just as deliberately. And then there was the way she was dressed. Beneath the char, the remnants of her clothing suggested layers, odd combinations of garments, like someone who'd been packing not for the weather, but for the need to disappear. And where the items might have carried brands or manufacturers, there was nothing. It was like she had removed every sign that she'd ever purchased anything, been anywhere, belonged to anyone. The body had been surrounded by what looked like personal effects: jewelry, an umbrella, a water bottle. But each of these too seemed curated, as though someone had placed them there after the fact. Not tossed, not dropped, arranged. There was a kind of deliberate choreography to the scene, something too ordered, too neat, and yet too horrific to be anything but real. It was in the unnatural peace of the moment, in the snow-dusted air heavy with the faint, acrid memory of fire, where the true weight of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just a death. This was a disappearance wrapped in performance, an extinguishing of identity that had not simply occurred. It had been orchestrated. The police officers who stood over her that day, cold breath fogging the winter air, had seen tragedy before. But this wasn't just grief. This was something older, something that echoed with secrecy. And in that moment, as the sun slid behind the pines and the shadows deepened, they knew they had stepped into a story that wasn't finished. A story that would stretch not just across borders, but across decades, silent, unsolved, and watching from just beyond the reach of certainty. But the mystery of that cold, silent valley didn't end with what was visible. Once her body had been taken from the mountainside and delivered to the sterile light of the forensics lab, the questions only deepened. The fire had taken much from her: her features, her hair, the clothes she wore, but not everything. And what remained told a story no less haunting than the scene in Isdal. Beneath the blackened surface, scientists began to sift through the evidence of a life hidden in plain sight. And what they found didn't bring them any closer to answers, only to more shadows. Inside her mouth, the forensic team noted something that raised an eyebrow and held it there. The dental work was sophisticated, intricate, and not of the kind typically done in Norway at that time. Her fillings, the materials used, the style of the dental reconstruction, it all suggested she'd sat in chairs across borders. Some hinted at German techniques, others perhaps from France or further south, as if her smile, now erased, had been assembled in fragments from different lives, in different places, none of which she'd left a name in. A mouth, like a passport, marked only by foreign hands, became the first clue that she may have walked in and out of places where identities changed more easily than money. And there was the soot, fine particles lodged deep in the windpipe and lungs. It spoke louder than any official report could. It told the investigators that when the flames were lit, she had still been breathing, still alive. The fire hadn't been a cover-up after death. It had been part of her ending. She had felt it, and that made all the difference. It wasn't just the idea of death that disturbed the people in those rooms. It was the cruelty of it. The slow and deliberate pain that came with a burning body forced to inhale the instruments of its own destruction. It was as if someone had wanted to erase her in the most unforgiving way, not just to remove her face from the world, but to erase the very breath from her story. There were pills, too. Traces of phenobarbital, a sedative, found inside her stomach. Not enough to stop her heart, but more than enough to make her limbs heavy, her will unsteady, her awareness foggy. A calculated dose, like someone had meant for her to be conscious but not in control. It was a grim detail, but one that pointed toward orchestration rather than despair. She didn't overdose. She didn't fade away peacefully beneath the trees. She was likely drugged, weakened, and then led to a death she could neither escape nor resist. Whether it was her own doing or someone else's was a question that lingered, unanswered, like smoke curling into the rafters of time. And then came the final indignity: her fingertips. What should have been the clearest trace of who she was had been taken from her with brutal precision. The skin had been deliberately altered, scraped, filed down until the ridges no longer formed patterns. No one does that on a whim. It takes time, and pain, and purpose. A person would only erase their own fingerprints if they were desperate to never be known, or perhaps, more chillingly, if they knew someone else intended to erase them for good. Either way, it made one thing painfully clear. Whoever she was, she either expected to vanish, or someone ensured that she would. The body was silent, but it wasn't speechless. Each detail uncovered added another thread to a web that stretched far beyond Norway's borders. Her death had not been the end of a sad story. It was the unveiling of one that had been hidden all along. And those who stared into that quiet face, those scorched lungs, those absent fingerprints, began to understand that this wasn't a woman who simply died in the woods. This was someone who had lived a life of shadows and who, even in death, remained just out of reach. In the days that followed her discovery, as the forensics team continued their work behind closed doors, the search extended outward. There were still threads dangling, still traces of her life waiting to be found, and one such thread led investigators to the Bergen railway station. It was there, amid the quiet shuffle of luggage and the comings and goings of strangers, that 2 suitcases sat unclaimed in a storage locker. They didn't seem extraordinary at first glance, just ordinary bags left behind by someone in a hurry perhaps. But when the keys in her belongings opened the locks, it became clear they were anything but ordinary. They were treasure chests of secrets, revealing not answers, but the true depth of her disappearance. Inside the suitcases, the first thing that struck investigators was the precision. Everything had its place. Neatly folded clothing, none of it bearing a single label. Not one brand name, not one identifying mark. It was as though someone had combed through each item and scrubbed away anything that might point to a store, a tailor, a country. And that kind of caution doesn't come from someone who's merely private. It comes from someone who knows that even a thread out of place could become a noose. Alongside the clothes were wigs, several of them. All carefully styled, different colors, different cuts. As if she'd been playing parts in a play only she understood. There were also eyeglasses, but curiously, none were prescription. They were props, meant to change a face, not to see with. And scattered throughout were coins and banknotes from several countries: Germany, Belgium, Switzerland, an array of currency that seemed to suggest she moved through Europe with ease, slipping across borders like a ghost. But what drew the most attention and raised the most questions was the small notepad found tucked in one of the compartments. The pages were filled with strange entries, letters, numbers, sequences that looked like gibberish at first glance. Yet as the investigators pored over them, it started to look more like a system, something methodical. Travel logs, perhaps. Codes denoting cities, dates, movements. It wasn't just a diary, it was a map of steps taken in the dark. Whoever she was, she hadn't been drifting without purpose. She had places to be, appointments to keep, and whatever mission had driven her, it had been recorded not in words of confession, but in careful cryptic shorthand that only made sense to her, or to someone else who shared her world. And still, with all of it laid out on the table, wigs, money, disguises, and codes, there was not one piece that told them who she was. No photographs, no letters, not even a book of matches from a cafe with a name scrawled on the back. It was as though she had lived her life wrapped in silence, every step forward covered with another layer of misdirection. Her suitcases should have been a revelation. Instead, they became another locked door. Because what the police found there wasn't the history of a person. It was the architecture of a role. The suitcases held the belongings of someone who had not just wanted to remain hidden, but had mastered the art of it. And as the questions kept piling up, one thing became increasingly clear. This woman hadn't simply disappeared in death. She'd been disappearing in life for a long, long time. And so, as the suitcases only deepened the shadows around her, the investigators turned their eyes to where she had walked before, tracing the footprints she left behind in a world that rarely notices those who choose to remain unseen. They began piecing together a trail from the notepad's cryptic notes, and from interviews with hoteliers and border records. What emerged was not a single life, but the outline of many. She had worn names like she wore wigs, slipping in and out of them as easily as one might change a coat. Each name was carefully chosen, European, plausible, but always just a little too polished, a little too interchangeable. Names like Vera Schlossneck, Alexia Zarna-Merchez, and, in other cases perhaps only loosely connected, the enigmatic Jennifer Fairgate. There were no birth certificates, no relatives, no homes. Just fragments of someone who'd been everywhere and belonged nowhere. Her journey across Europe wasn't leisurely. It was calculated, precise. She moved from Paris to Milan, from Hamburg to Oslo, and always in a pattern that seemed erratic until you looked closer. She rarely stayed in one place for long. Hotel clerks recalled a woman who was soft-spoken but watchful, calm, but always aware of her surroundings. She would check in under one name, sometimes with a small accent difficult to place, and before the staff could form a memory of her, she was gone. She often asked to change rooms, sometimes immediately after checking in. She gave vague reasons, too much noise, a draft in the window. But to anyone paying attention, it was clear. She wanted to stay unpredictable. She didn't want her movements tracked, her habits memorized. She left as little behind as possible. A single night's imprint on a mattress, a name in a registry, and nothing else. Some remembered her elegance, the way she carried herself. Graceful, but not flashy. Like someone who had learned to be noticed just enough, and then forgotten. She spoke several languages, slipping between them as easily as she crossed borders. She understood the kind of fluency that doesn't just come from study, but from survival. A woman like that didn't just learn French or German for the sake of travel. She needed them. She needed to blend, to vanish in plain sight, to become part of the background noise of crowded cities. Those wigs, those glasses, weren't vanity. They were tools. The tools of someone who understood that staying alive sometimes meant being someone else, over and over again. And that's the part that lingers, because behind each name was a different woman, and yet always the same person looking back from behind the mask. What was she running from, or toward? Was she hiding because she was hunted? Or because she had seen something she should not have? The truth remains buried under those identities, as carefully buried as her fingerprints and her past. And every time one of those names surfaced, it didn't bring her closer to life. It only added to the silence that surrounded her. A woman with so many names and yet somehow still, no one. What made the truth even harder to pin down was the time in which she moved, the kind of world that didn't welcome questions, only silence. The Cold War wasn't just a battle of ideologies. It was a game played in the shadows, where borders meant little, and allegiances shifted like smoke. Norway, nestled up there near the Arctic winds, might have seemed distant from the heat of that global standoff. But it was a NATO stronghold all the same. A quiet stage for louder secrets. Her roots weren't just random. With each thread pulled, it became clear that her footsteps often traced close to military sites, places where missiles were tested, where foreign eyes might be interested in what the Norwegians were building or hiding. It was subtle at first, a pattern only noticed when viewed from far above, as if her map had been drawn not by curiosity, but by instruction. That idea began to fester. Was she a courier, carrying messages across borders under false names? Was she collecting photographs of restricted areas or gauging the rhythm of patrols? The contents of her luggage, currencies from different countries, disguises, a notepad filled with cipher-like markings, all matched the profile that intelligence agencies whispered about in their own dim rooms. People who moved with no roots, whose faces changed just enough to escape recognition, who never formed bonds that could betray them. And when you stack all that against the silence she left behind, the scale starts to tip. She wasn't just hiding from the world she might have been trained to, but even spies, if that's what she was, are still human. And in the final days, something changed. The veil slipped just enough for others to notice. Staff at her final hotel said she didn't speak much, and when she did, her voice carried that same careful weight, like someone who measures every word before letting it out. She kept her back to the walls, her eyes on every reflection. The kind of behavior that seems odd only if you've never had to look over your shoulder to stay alive. One witness, whose story came too late to save her, remembered seeing her talking with a man. A tall figure, wrapped in a military-style trench coat. The kind you'd expect in a black-and-white film, not a quiet Norwegian street. What they discussed, no one heard. But whatever it was the last known interaction before she disappeared. Others in Bergen, though few, remembered her as someone who didn't quite fit, though they couldn't say why. She never stayed long enough to raise suspicion, but something about her stayed with them afterward. The way she avoided eye contact, the way she walked like someone who didn't want to leave footprints. And then she was gone. Not just from the hotel or the city, but from every record, every trail. If she did meet someone that night, someone who knew her real name or her real mission, There's no telling whether they were friend or foe. What's clear is that she didn't leave of her own accord, and so the story spirals inward, like smoke curling around something invisible at its center. Maybe she was a spy. Maybe she was something else entirely. But in a world split by walls, wires, and whispers, she moved like someone with purpose, and she vanished like someone who knew too much. Still, despite all the signs, despite the inconsistencies and the echoes of something far more deliberate, the story was given a quiet, final chapter, one that didn't quite match the mystery it followed. The authorities, perhaps eager to find a conclusion in a case that yielded none of the usual answers, eventually called it suicide. They marked the file, filed the papers, and tried to let the questions rest. But the problem was, the pieces didn't lie still. They never really did. The scene itself refused that label. Because a woman who goes to such lengths to erase herself, scraping off her fingerprints, removing tags from every belonging, using names that were never hers, doesn't usually leave behind a scene as chaotic and telling as the one in that valley. There was no lighter found beside her, no matchbook tucked in her clothes, no trace of the tool that could have set such a fire. And this wasn't a simple flame. This was heat strong enough to burn flesh and bone, to consume a body in open air, and still leave enough behind to speak in riddles. The question lingered like smoke on cold air. How could she have done that alone? And if this was truly the end she chose, why stage it so carefully? Her hands were clenched, not relaxed, suggesting pain, not peace. Her body was placed almost deliberately, not crumpled by chance. And there was something theatrical in how it all looked, something unsettling in the quiet arrangement of clues that offered no straight line. People who end their lives rarely take such pains to hide who they were. More often than not, they leave a note, a trace, a name. But this woman seemed to want the exact opposite, obliteration. Not just of life, but of identity, of history. As if she knew too well the dangers of being remembered. So then you're left with a hollow verdict. A label that says, suicide, resting on a scene that seems to resist it at every turn. And in the silence that follows, you can almost hear the weight of unanswered questions pressing down, as if the land itself remembers what the paperwork forgot. Maybe it was easier to close the case than to chase the dark corridors it hinted toward. Maybe someone wanted it closed, but the truth, whatever it was, remains just out of reach, sealed beneath fire and silence. And yet some stories don't stay buried, not even beneath time thick as snow. As the years drifted on, the world changed. But her story never truly went cold. It lingered in whispers, in folders left too long unopened, in the minds of those who couldn't let go of the way she vanished behind fire and silence. Then, decades later, long after official interest had faded, something remarkable happened. Ordinary people began to ask again. Not because they had to, but because they felt someone should. In 2016, Norwegian journalists at NRK stepped forward with a new lens, one shaped by persistence and modern tools, launching a podcast called Death in Ice Valley. It didn't offer answers straight away, but it brought the Isdal woman back into the public eye, not as a relic of Cold War paranoia or police oversight, but as a human mystery worth revisiting. Listeners from around the globe began to send in tips, fragments of memory, thoughts from towns half a world away. It wasn't evidence in the traditional sense, but it was something just as vital, a sign that people still cared. By 2020, science had caught up to the story in ways no one could have predicted back in 1970. Through DNA phenotyping, a process that takes the raw script of our biology and tries to draw a portrait, researchers began to trace the woman's ancestral roots. Her markers pointed towards Central Europe, places like Germany, Luxembourg, and France. It narrowed the search, at least on paper, shrinking a world of billions into something a little more precise. And yet, even with this technology, even with modern databases and worldwide appeal, her name stayed hidden. No family came forward. No match lit up the screen. No childhood photo. No yearbook. No distant cousin reaching out to say, "I think I knew her." Because whoever she was, she had done more than disappear. She had unraveled herself from history with the quiet precision of someone who'd planned it for a long, long time. And now, even with science cracking the locks, even with voices rising to speak her story again, she remains a ghost between lines of code and strands of hair. too real to forget, too distant to know. But even with all the advancements and renewed interest, the truth remains elusive, like a figure just out of focus in the corner of your eye. And that's where the theories begin to fill the silence, each one a different lens on the same unsolvable riddle. Was she a spy, operating in the shadows, a ghost sent from one government to quietly observe another? The kind of life where names are as temporary as the hotel rooms you sleep in, and loyalty can vanish just as easily as you can. If that were true, then maybe she was eliminated by the very agency that once trained her, cut loose because she knew too much, or worse, because she had seen something she wasn't meant to see. Others imagine a woman wrapped in something far darker and colder, an underworld courier perhaps, moving discreet packages across borders. Maybe she wasn't just a traveler. Maybe she was part of a network that dealt in things no country wanted to admit existed. Black market dealings have their own rules, and mistakes in that line of work aren't forgiven with apologies. They're paid for in blood and silence. If she was caught in a web like that, then her final moments may not have been about secrets or loyalties, but punishment and warning. There's also a version of this story where elegance masks desperation, where the woman who moved with purpose and grace was simply trying to outrun something too heavy to carry. Maybe her past was full of personal shadows, and the wigs, the names, the disguises. Those weren't tools of espionage, but acts of survival. If so, then the fire wasn't a cover-up, but a farewell, a painful, deliberate end from someone who didn't want to be remembered by the life she left behind. Yet even that doesn't quite explain the missing lighter, the strange suitcase contents, or the near-clinical way her identity was erased. And so she lingers. Not just in cold case files or the fading edge of old newspapers, but in the imagination of anyone who hears about her. She's become a legacy, not of who she was, but of how much we still don't know. She belongs to that peculiar place between fact and fiction, where mystery becomes a kind of mirror, reflecting not only what might have happened to her, but what kind of world allows a person to vanish so completely. A story not just about death, but about how easily someone can live among us, unnoticed, and leave behind a silence so loud we still strain to hear what it might be trying to say. And so, after all the theories have been whispered and the files have grown brittle with time, we come to the part of the story that refuses to settle into certainty. The part where the echo is louder than the voice, and all we are left with are the questions she never answered. Who was she running from? What did she see that made her change names like seasons and move across borders like a shadow on a wall? Who watched her last? And did they walk away quietly, or leave her to the fire and the silence as a final punctuation mark? It's not just the absence of her name that haunts us. It's the deliberate erasure of it, the surgical care with which her trail was covered, the absence of a lighter in a place where a woman burned alive, and the unspoken choreography of fear and intention that played out before her final breath. The world keeps records of people who mattered, who belonged somewhere, to someone. But she is different. She stands on the outside of all that. Not because she didn't matter, but because someone made sure her name would never rise from the ashes. In the end, it is not the mystery that makes the story endure, but the silence that follows it. A silence that wraps itself around that cold slope in Norway, around the bones and the suitcase, around the coded notebook and the false names. A silence that asks, not just what happened to her, but how a person can be so thoroughly erased, even in the modern world, even with all our tools, all our data, all our eyes. 50 years have passed. Technologies have changed. The Cold War that once cast long shadows has faded into the pages of history books. But the Isdal woman remains untouched by time. She is not simply unsolved, she is unknowable. A ghost, not of superstition, but of reality. A figure formed not from fantasy, but from our failure to understand. And in that quiet failure, she continues to haunt us, not as a specter from beyond, but as a reflection of just how much can disappear in plain sight. Two men lie on a grassy slope just outside the sprawling city of Niterói, Brazil. The year is 1966. The air is thick with humidity and the quiet hum of distant traffic. Their bodies are still. No wounds, no blood, No sign of violence or panic. Just the strange, deliberate scene of two men in formal suits and raincoats, side by side like comrades on a final journey. Draped over their eyes are crude, handmade lead masks, cut carefully, smoothed at the edges, meant not to shield them from the world around them, but from something unseen, something radiant. Their pockets hold no identification, no last goodbyes, just a cryptic note that reads like the script of a ritual. 1630. Be at the agreed place. 1830. Ingest capsules. After effect, protect metals await signal mask. No one saw them die. No one heard a scream. Only a boy chasing his kite stumbled upon the riddle they became, long after the final act had already unfolded. You can almost imagine the silence of that hill, the way the grass moved softly in the wind, the way their hands rested peacefully at their sides. Nothing about the scene suggested fear or struggle. If they were afraid, they had long since made peace with it. These weren't the disheveled remnants of a crime. This was organized, purposeful. It was as if these two men had stepped out of the regular rhythm of the world and entered a realm governed by a logic none of us fully understand. There were no tracks leading away, no signs that anyone else had been there. Just them, and the vast empty sky overhead, waiting for something that may never have come, or perhaps came and went in a form we're not prepared to see. Their names, once the story broke, surfaced slowly. Manuel Pereira da Cruz and Miguel José Viana. Ordinary men by all accounts. Technicians by trade. The kind of people who know how wires work, how signals move invisibly through the air. Friends described them as quiet, decent, not prone to wild behavior. And yet, they had clearly ventured into something strange together, something far beyond the limits of their day jobs. Their families, left behind with no answers, had nothing but this trail of peculiar details. 2 towels, an empty water bottle, a notebook with directions that sound almost like instructions for a journey, across a border we don't have a name for. And those masks, not theatrical, not ceremonial, practical, as if meant to do something, as if they expected to see something. In the weeks that followed, friends and acquaintances told a quieter story that had been hiding beneath the surface. These men had an interest in spiritualism, not the parlor tricks of mediums or stage illusions, but something more intense, a belief in energy, light, perhaps contact with entities or intelligences from beyond the earth. They had in fact carried out experiments before. Strange experiments, using masks, using light. Some spoke of scientific spiritualism, of attempts to push consciousness past its normal limits. Others remembered them mentioning the idea of meeting something at a specific time, a signal, an effect. Whatever it was they were trying to reach, it seems they believed the masks would protect them from light too powerful for the human eye. But no light ever scorched that hillside. No ship ever landed. No message was heard by anyone else. The autopsy was a failure in almost every sense. Delayed, mishandled. By the time doctors could examine the bodies, the organs had decayed too far to test for toxins or drugs. No poison was found. No sign of asphyxiation. Just a mystery. The kind that sinks its teeth into the imagination and refuses to let go. Strangely, the bodies had not started to smell for several days, something local police noted with unease. Theories of radiation were floated, but tests came back negative. Still, the sense lingered that something about their deaths wasn't natural, or at least not explainable by the tools we usually use to separate the real from the impossible. And so the speculation began, that they were expecting aliens. That the masks were to protect against some luminous contact, not of this world. Or that they were attempting to leave their physical bodies through some chemical or spiritual means. The phrase, await signal, looms large. From where? From whom? Were they trying to be vessels for something unseen, or simply misguided, chasing light where there was none? Maybe it was a ritual, a way to ascend. Maybe they believed, deeply, that what they were doing would carry them into a different state of being. It's easy to dismiss. But then again, we weren't there. We didn't see what they saw, if they saw anything at all. Others have tried to pull the story down to earth. Maybe it was a hoax. Maybe someone led them to believe in this ritual for reasons unknown, manipulated them, or worse. Maybe they were murdered and this strange arrangement was just a cover. But there were no suspects, no fingerprints, no signs of restraint or struggle. Some thought it could have been a scam gone wrong, but both men died. Together. Without a struggle. Without chaos. If it was suicide, it was one of the most intricate, serene suicides ever committed. With no farewell, no message to loved ones, just that note, just that mask, just that hill, just that mask. In the end, the facts are as unyielding as they are unsatisfying. Two men walked up a hill one August evening, prepared to meet something. Maybe death. Maybe God. Maybe light itself. We can't know. All we have are fragments, a notebook, a mask, a question. And the wind, still whispering through the grass of Morro do Vintém, like it remembers something we don't. Like it saw what they saw, whatever it was. What do you think they were waiting for? Whatever brought those men to that hill, it wasn't desperation. It felt like intent. And days after they'd made their final journey, the world around them simply continued. People passed by unaware. Life in Niterói moved on under the same sun, under the same indifferent sky. Until August 20th, when the veil was pulled back, not by police, not by investigators, but by a boy chasing the wind with a kite. There's something achingly human about that. A child running through the scrub of Morro do Vintém, probably not thinking about death, just tethered to a line of string drawn along by a toy. And then, the sudden stop. That stillness. The kind that doesn't belong to the living. He must have stood there, frozen, trying to understand what he was seeing. Two bodies laid out side by side, not hidden, not discarded, not buried or burnt or bloodied, just placed. As though sleep had taken them while they waited for something, or someone, that never came. They wore raincoats despite the dry skies, and over their eyes, those strange, smooth lead masks, like blindfolds made for a different kind of sight. Their faces were not twisted in fear or pain. There was no panic in their posture, no struggle in the grass around them. It wasn't a scene of violence, it was a scene of silence. The boy ran home, and the authorities were called. But when the adults arrived, they found no clearer answers. Only questions multiplying in the sunlight. There were no wounds, no weapons. No sign of who they were or why they were there, at least not at first. The bodies hadn't been scavenged by animals, despite being in the open. There was a kind of sacredness to the positioning, as if they had followed steps to a ritual. And the end was just the last instruction followed to the letter. This wasn't a crime scene in the usual sense. It felt more like an interruption. Like two people had stepped off the train of ordinary life and left their seats behind without telling anyone where they were going. And the strangest part, perhaps stranger than the masks or the note or even the untouched stillness, was the atmosphere that lingered. Officers and journalists alike reported a sense of unease that clung to the sight. Not horror, not revulsion, just a quiet wrongness, as if something invisible had passed through and the hillside still remembered. You could feel it in the air, like static after a storm, or the leftover hush in a theater long after the curtain falls. People tried to make sense of it. They looked for footprints, for traces of poison, for signs that the men had been moved or manipulated. But the earth gave up no answers. The scene had already said all it was going to say. It offered no closure, only curiosity, and that terrible sense that whatever happened, it had been planned. And yet it made no sense at all. Two raincoats, two men, two masks, one impossible silence. Have you ever felt a place remember something you don't? And in that silence, as investigators searched the bodies and scanned the hillside, the story deepened. Not with answers, but with symbols, gestures, things that felt like parts of a ritual too old or too strange to decode. There was no wallet or family photograph to tether these men back to the world they came from. Instead, in the pocket of one of the raincoats, they found a small notebook. Worn. Almost humble. But inside it, a message. Not a confession, not a warning, but a schedule, carefully written in plain language that made no ordinary sense. 1630 be at the agreed place. 1830 ingest capsules. After effect protect metals await signal mask. As if this were not death, but a procedure. As if they had a place to be, a thing to do, and a signal they were waiting for, from someone who'd promised to send it. There's something haunting in the neatness of it. A time to arrive. A time to act. Capsules. Though none were ever found. And then afterward, the effect, whatever that was meant to be. It reads like instructions for a transformation. Like something you'd carry in your pocket if you thought you were about to step into a different kind of existence. It suggests obedience, faith, maybe even awe. But the deeper you look, the less it explains. There's no name at the top, no context. Just those disjointed pieces, like a map missing the key. And when the experts tried to test for drugs, hallucinogens, sedatives, poisons, they came up empty. No substances were ever detected. But then again, the autopsy had come too late for precision. Too many hours passed, too much time lost, and with it, the chance to know what those capsules really were, or whether they were ever swallowed at all. Beside the notebook were the other remnants of preparation. An empty water bottle, used maybe to swallow pills, or maybe just carried for comfort. 2 towels, folded and clean. Some speculated they were to lie on. Others said they were to cover their faces or to clean themselves before the moment came. There's no way to be sure. What we do know is that these weren't random objects. They were chosen, packed with purpose. The same with those lead masks. Smoothly made, shaped precisely to curve over the eyes, as though tailored not just to block light, but to fit, like armor crafted for a specific purpose, one only they understood. You could tell they weren't the work of amateurs. They were deliberate, even careful. Protective, not decorative. But protective from what? No light scorched that hillside. No sound split the sky. Whatever they were waiting for never arrived, or if it did, it left no trace. The instruments of their ritual lay silent. No heat, no energy, no radiation on their skin, no damage in their bones. Just a sense that this had been carried out with the kind of faith you only bring to something greater than yourself. Something invisible. Something promised. It's not the strangeness that stays with you. It's the precision. These weren't men who stumbled into danger. They followed it, step by step, trusting a path laid out either by someone else, or by something none of us have ever met. What kind of signal were they waiting for? And so we follow the thread back. Not to the masks, or the capsule, or the lonely hill where it all ended, but to the men themselves. Manuel Pereira da Cruz and Miguel José Viana. Friends, colleagues, both technicians in the quiet working-class town of Campos dos Goitacazes, just over 100 miles from where their story would vanish into silence. These were not wanderers or madmen. They weren't drifters chasing wild visions. They were television repairmen, men who spent their days working with wires, signals, circuits, men who understood the difference between noise and clarity. They had families, they had neighbors, they were known, and nothing in their pasts whispered of chaos or delusion. There's something deeply unsettling about that kind of normalcy. Because it means whatever drew them up, that hill wasn't born from madness or desperation. It came from somewhere quieter, somewhere considered. These were men who fixed things, who understood systems, who believed in function. And yet, at some point, they started believing in something else. Something not found in blueprints or manuals. Something that made them pack towels and lead and raincoats, that made them write down times and phrases and wait patiently for a signal that never came, or came and didn't leave a mark. You imagine them leaving their homes that day, saying goodbye like it was just another errand. Maybe they told their families they'd be back later. Maybe they said nothing at all. But what's clear is that they weren't fleeing. They weren't lost. They were heading toward something. The people who knew them later said they'd been interested in spiritual ideas, theories of energy, perhaps even communication with other realms. But there's no hard line connecting those ideas to that place, to that moment. Just traces. A trail of questions they never got to answer. What makes it harder to grasp is how ordinary they seemed. 2 quiet men, with no enemies, no secrets anyone could point to. They weren't leaders or followers in any known group. No history of violence. No arrests. They were simply men who at some point became convinced that something extraordinary was possible, and that they might be the ones to find it. Maybe it was belief. Maybe it was trust in a promise someone made to them. Maybe it was hope disguised as science. But whatever it was, it pulled them far from home, into a place where nothing made sense afterward, and where they waited, prepared for something only they expected to see. And that's what haunts you. That quiet certainty. That willingness to step away from everything they knew, not in fear or confusion, but with the calm purpose of people who believed they were exactly where they were supposed to be. And when you begin to trace the outlines of their final decisions, when you try to understand not just what they did but why, a pattern starts to form. Faint, fractured, but there. Friends and acquaintances came forward in the days after their deaths, offering pieces of the puzzle, and what emerged was a portrait of two men drawn not only to the world of electronics and circuits, but to something far less tangible. Manuel and Miguel had become deeply interested in spiritualism, not in the vague, fashionable sense, but in the old-world, structured kind: rituals, seances, theories of life beyond the physical. They weren't just curious, they were committed. They believed in forces that couldn't be seen with ordinary eyes. And more than that, they believed those forces could be studied, summoned, and, with the right preparation, contacted. They weren't the first to think that way. Brazil has long been a landscape of complex spiritual traditions, Catholicism woven with Spiritist philosophy, African-rooted rituals braided into daily life. But what made these two different was the way they mixed that belief with a kind of scientific curiosity. They spoke of scientific spiritual experiments, as if the divine could be measured, as if the unseen might appear if only the signal could be tuned correctly. People who knew them said they had conducted small tests before, involving light, energy, and those same lead masks. Always with precision, always with purpose. They weren't trying to escape reality, they were trying to push it open. And the masks, so strange, so silent, take on a different weight when you hear that. If you believe you're about to witness something transcendent, something that might not behave like the natural world, then shielding your eyes isn't madness. It's caution. It's belief that the vision could be too much, too bright, too powerful to bear. Whether it was a UFO, a spiritual entity, or some radiant burst of knowledge, they seemed to expect light, intense, possibly divine. The masks weren't decorations. They were equipment, not for a journey of the body, but for the spirit. They weren't preparing to run. They were preparing to receive. And perhaps that's the most human part of all. That these two men, living modest lives in a modest town, believed they had found a way to touch something vast. They didn't need telescopes or temples. They needed timing, intention, and trust. They followed instructions, built their tools, and climbed that hill because they believed something extraordinary was going to meet them there. And the thing about belief, real belief, is that it doesn't ask to be proven before it moves you. It simply asks that you go. So they did. And when belief collides with mystery, when the hopeful reach for the unknown ends not in revelation but silence, the questions left behind begin to harden. That's where this story turns colder. Less about what they thought might happen, and more about what did. After the bodies were found, there should have been answers. There should have been a process. Medical, clinical, forensic. But something went wrong. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in the slow, grinding failure of systems meant to bring clarity. The autopsy didn't happen right away. Days passed. Bureaucracy, lack of urgency, perhaps confusion. Whatever the cause, by the time the examination began, the bodies were already too far gone. Their internal organs had decomposed beyond use. The window for toxicology had closed, and with it, the one clear chance at knowing how they died. That alone would be troubling. But there's another wrinkle. Witnesses who came close to the scene in those first days claimed something strange, something hard to quantify. They said there was no smell, no rot, no stench of death that should have been present in the Brazilian heat, especially on an open hillside. These weren't just passing remarks. These were people who knew what death should look like. And it wasn't this. Some wondered aloud. Had the bodies been preserved? Was there something in those capsules that didn't kill, but slowed the body's decay? Others went further. They spoke of radiation, of exposure to something foreign, unnatural, something that didn't leave burns, but perhaps left time itself disrupted. You could dismiss that as folklore, the kind of speculation that fills a void when facts are absent. But even folklore comes from somewhere. The idea that they didn't die in a conventional way, didn't decay like they should have, isn't just haunting. It changes the temperature of the entire story. Because if they weren't just victims of poor judgment or a failed experiment, if their deaths defied explanation on a cellular level, then we're not in the realm of tragic curiosity anymore. We're in territory where science takes a step back and something else steps forward. But perhaps the hardest part is knowing that we'll never know for certain, because the clock ran out, not on the day they died, but in the days afterward, when human error let the truth slip away. If those capsules held something lethal, we can't prove it. If their bodies were altered by an unseen force, there's no data left to test. What remains is absence, a blank where there should be a cause, an end without a reason. And for those who knew them, for the families who waited for answers, that kind of silence is the loudest thing of all. And when all the rational doors have quietly closed, when medicine offers no cause, no clues, and time has erased what little could have been known, what's left behind is the kind of space where stranger thoughts begin to echo. You can feel them pressing in around the edges of the known world. Not loud, not wild, but persistent, like a whisper you're not sure you heard. For some, that whisper becomes a theory. That these two men hadn't just wandered into misfortune, but into contact. That the masks, the timing, the instructions, they weren't delusions, and they weren't metaphors. They were preparations for something real, something not of this earth. In that light, no pun intended, the pieces begin to change shape. If you believe in the possibility of contact with other worlds, of entities that don't move through time the way we do, that don't think in words or gestures we'd recognize, then everything they did starts to look less like madness and more like ritual compliance. The lead masks? A primitive kind of shielding, not from a human explosion, but from something brighter, something sacred or simply foreign. A light that doesn't just blind the eyes, but overwhelms the mind. The towels, the capsules, the precise times, they could be interpreted as coordinates, steps in a process, or maybe responses to instructions given, not invented. And that note, cryptic as it was, might not have come from their own imagination at all. Some say it reads like a translation, not a message born of instinct, but of repetition. A script handed down, a protocol from somewhere else. That, somewhere else, is where belief begins to branch. To some, it was a craft from another planet, following patterns in the sky most of us don't see. To others, it wasn't about planets at all. It was dimensional, entities slipping through thin places in our reality, showing themselves not in physical form, but in signal, in vision, in overwhelming light. In either case, the theory suggests these men were not confused, not hallucinating, but chosen, or at the very least, willing. They thought they were going to be met. And the thing is, the human mind craves connection. We long for signs that we're not alone, that the stories we tell ourselves about the stars, about hidden worlds and secret truths, might actually brush up against something real. When you live a quiet life in a small town, the idea that you could step beyond the veil, that you could be part of a meeting not meant for most people, that kind of purpose can become more powerful than fear. It can feel like destiny, and maybe that's what they felt on that hill, sitting with their backs straight, masks ready, facing nothing and waiting for everything. But if they were wrong, if nothing came, if no one ever answered, then all we're left with is silence wrapped in mystery. And if they were right, then perhaps the question isn't why they died, but what they saw before the end, and why whatever it was has never come back. And when the idea of otherworldly contact begins to stretch the edges of what we can believe, some turn inward instead, to the mind, to altered perception, to the possibility that the journey those men were preparing for wasn't about going somewhere else in space or time, but deep inside themselves. If the light they were bracing for wasn't extraterrestrial, but inner, if the masks weren't for protection against the stars, but for shielding the fragile boundary between the waking world and whatever lies beyond it, then we find ourselves facing a different kind of mystery. One not about beings from afar, but about two men who may have believed they'd found a method to transcend the limits of the body, to reach higher consciousness, or to dissolve entirely into some waiting other. There are those who believe that what happened on that hillside was a ritual, quiet, personal, and deliberate. Not the pageantry of religion, but something more private, something experimental. That note, with its cold timings and simple commands, has all the cadence of instruction. Not a prayer, not a plea, but a step-by-step to transformation. Perhaps it was meant to guide them into a state where they could leave their bodies behind, not through death, necessarily, but through the mind. If hallucinogens were involved, the delay in the autopsy erased any chance to detect them, and that absence left the door open, swinging wide, for speculation, not just about drugs, but about purpose. Because you don't walk calmly into death for a high. You do it, maybe, if you think you're unlocking something. And what of the towels? Those small, almost laughably ordinary objects in the middle of something that seems anything but. Some believe they were for comfort, a practical touch in a final moment. Others think they had a deeper purpose. To insulate, to cover, to contain heat, or maybe to absorb something more abstract. Energy, radiance, spirit. When you start looking through the lens of ritual, everything becomes symbolic. The placement of the bodies, the stillness, the absence of chaos. It doesn't feel like an accident. It feels choreographed, as if something sacred, or at least sacred to them, was happening, and they had prepared for it meticulously. And maybe that's the most haunting part, that they believed, deeply, with such conviction that they climbed a hill with their tools and their masks, their timing and their quiet, and did something we still can't understand. Maybe they saw the face of a god, or maybe they slipped into a silence so deep they never came back. Either way, they weren't running. They were ready. And in that stillness, in that choice, there's something deeply human. Not just mystery, but meaning. Or at least, the aching need for it. And when belief doesn't quite fill the silence, and transcendence begins to feel too abstract, the mind circles back towards something colder, something more familiar. It wonders if these men were not seekers but victims, not visionaries but pawns. There's an ache to understand why two lives would end with such eerie precision, without the usual signs of desperation or chaos. And when people can't find the cause inside the men themselves, they begin to look outward. Was this some kind of manipulation? Did someone use their curiosity, their trust, or even their hope, and lead them step by step toward death? There were no suspects, no struggle, no footprints in the soil that didn't belong. But even in the absence of evidence, the theory persists. What if someone they knew, someone they respected, guided them? A charismatic figure, a mentor, or even a group with strange beliefs and stronger influence. Brazil in the 1960s had its fair share of spiritual movements, fringe science circles, and secret societies quietly testing the edges of faith and science alike. It isn't impossible to imagine a scenario where the men didn't write that note themselves, or at least didn't fully understand it. That they were told, gently or otherwise, that this was how to reach the next level, to make contact, to awaken something. And they believed it. That's the dangerous thing about trust. It can look a lot like peace, right up until the end. Some have called it suicide, but that word carries weight these men didn't leave behind. No letters, no explanations for loved ones, no debt, no signs of mental unraveling, just methodical planning and absolute silence. If they meant to leave the world behind, they did it without drama, without warning. That kind of calm doesn't feel like despair. It feels like conviction, which is what makes it all so unsettling. You're left not with the image of men who gave up, but men who followed something through to the end, something only they seem to understand. Then there's the theory that none of it was meant to end in death at all, that it was a scam, maybe spiritual or scientific, that misfired. Perhaps they were planning to fake something, to create a moment of mystery or illusion they could later explain or profit from. But if it was a hoax, it's one that never had a punchline. The masks, the timing, the careful arrangements, they don't serve much of a purpose if there's no audience, no message left behind. And two men dying for a story no one tells makes little sense unless they thought there would be a story, unless they thought they'd be around to tell it. Theories keep multiplying because the facts refuse to. People see in the gaps whatever their own fears and fascinations bring forward. A cult, a betrayal, a plan gone wrong. All possible. All unproven. What remains is this. Two men died on a hill without a mark on them, dressed for something invisible, waiting for something silent. Whether that silence was given to them or done to them, we may never know. But it lingers. And it asks more of us than most mysteries ever do. And so we find ourselves at the edge of the same hill, looking down into the same quiet riddle that's haunted generations. Time has passed. Entire lives have come and gone since those two men took their final steps into the unknown, yet nothing has risen to fill the space they left behind. The masks, still stored away in some archive, gathering dust, haven't offered up any new answers. The note remains as strange as the day it was written, its meaning either too clear to be real or too elusive to ever be useful. And the story, well, it's grown larger in the absence of certainty, wrapped now in layers of folklore, suspicion, fascination, and grief. What makes this mystery so difficult to forget isn't just the lack of evidence or the strangeness of the objects. It's the way it touches something quiet inside us, the part of the human soul that still looks up at the stars and wonders, the part that whispers that maybe there is something else out there, something just beyond the veil. Not everyone climbs a hill with a mask and a mission, but all of us, at one time or another, have stared into the dark and hoped there was something waiting on the other side of it. And maybe that's why these two men, whose names most of the world had never heard before 1966, have stayed in our collective memory. Not because of what we know about them, but because of how deeply we don't. It's easier sometimes to explain away the unknown, to stamp it with words like hallucination, delusion, error. But there's something about the sheer quiet of their end, the lack of chaos, the absence of clues, that resists all our usual answers. If they were chasing light, they found only shadow. If they were expecting revelation, all they got was silence. And if someone else orchestrated their fate, they did so with the kind of invisible hand that leaves not even a fingerprint behind. We're left, then, not with a solution, but a kind of lingering invitation. Not to solve it, perhaps, but to sit with it, to let it remind us that not every question comes with a clear reply, that some riddles are doorways, not destinations, and some stories aren't meant to end with certainty, but with awe. Two men climbed a hill with metal masks, prepared to see something we'll never understand. What did they witness, if anything at all? Was it madness, mystery, or something not meant for us to comprehend? Maybe the final answer is this. They reached for something just outside the limits of what we call real. And whether they found it or were simply consumed by the search, they became part of the very mystery they chased. It was the kind of morning that feels like it's holding its breath. A soft December wind whispered off the ocean, brushing over Somerton Beach, Adelaide. Waves rolled in quietly, unbothered by the quiet spectacle that lay slumped near the seawall. A man, still, legs crossed at the ankles like he had simply sat down to rest and forgot to wake up. The sand beneath him was undisturbed, his face calm, no signs of a struggle, no marks of pain or fear. For early passers-by, it might have looked like a man who'd fallen asleep while watching the sea. But he was dead, and no one knew who he was. He wore a perfectly pressed suit, shoes polished, shirt crisp. Not a single label remained on his clothing. Even the stitching where the brand tags once were had been carefully removed, like someone had gone out of their way to erase where this man came from. No hat, no wallet, no form of identification. It was as though he'd stepped out of the world and into nothingness, shedding every trace of who he'd been. The first police officers on the scene couldn't make sense of it. No signs of trauma, no blood, no weapon. Just a dead man dressed too well for a beach, too calm to have suffered, and far too mysterious for it to be a coincidence. The autopsy only thickened the fog. His heart was strong. No signs of natural disease. His organs were congested, which hinted at poisoning, but no foreign substance could be found in his body, not by the tests they had then. He was healthy, well-built, with calves shaped like a ballet dancer's, strong and defined, like someone who had spent his life running or dancing. His teeth didn't match dental records anywhere in Australia. Everything about him was precise, intentional. And yet, whoever he was, he didn't exist. And then they found the suitcase, tucked away at the Adelaide railway station, unclaimed, its ticket dated the day before his death. Inside, a series of strange, mundane items. A shaving kit, a stenciling brush, some tools. Some of them common enough. But others, their tags had also been carefully cut away. No initials, no addresses, nothing you could pin down to a man with a name. It was as if he had prepared to vanish, and the suitcase was all that was left of the plan. But there was no map, no direction. Just objects. Objects and silence. The silence didn't break until someone noticed the tiniest of details. A small hidden pocket sewn deep into the waistband of his trousers. Inside, a tiny rolled scrap of paper. A phrase typed in Persian. Taman Shud. It is finished. Not torn from a newspaper, not scribbled by hand, but clipped, deliberately, from a printed book. It was the kind of message that felt like the end of a story. But here, it was only the beginning. The phrase was traced back to an English translation of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a book that speaks of fate, of the fleeting nature of life, of how no one can unwrite what has already been written. Days later, someone turned in a copy of the very book, the last page torn out, the missing piece matching exactly the scrap in the man's trousers. The book had been left in the back seat of an unlocked car just blocks away from where the body was found. In its margins, a phone number, and something even more cryptic. A series of letters arranged like a code. A cipher, a message perhaps, or nothing at all. But it was there, waiting to be solved. The phone number belonged to a woman, Jessica Thompson, a nurse who lived near the beach. She said she didn't know the man, had no idea why her number was in the book. But when shown a plaster bust of his face, her reaction was off. She didn't just look surprised, she looked shaken, like something from deep within her had stirred. Her son, Robin, had ears like the man's, rarely shaped, almost genetically unique. His dental structure, too, eerily similar. And so, a new question crept in. Was this stranger Robin's father? And if so, why the secrecy? Why the silence? There were whispers that Jessica had connections to people involved in intelligence during the war. Some thought the man was a spy. Some thought she was, too. It was the middle of the Cold War, after all. The world was a place of secrets, and Australia wasn't untouched by that invisible game. There were codes, informants, double lives. Maybe he was a courier. Maybe he knew too much. Maybe he chose to vanish before someone helped him vanish. Theories poured in like the tide. Suicide? A broken heart hidden beneath well-polished shoes? Or murder? Clean, clinical, undetectable? And that code? Never cracked? Even by seasoned cryptographers? Was it a message never meant to be read? For decades, the mystery sat like a ghost in the archives. And then, decades later, in 2021, his body was exhumed. Science had changed. DNA spoke a language no code could hide from. And in 2022, a name surfaced. Carl Webb. An electrical engineer from Melbourne. A man who had vanished from the records, just disappeared one day. But if it was Carl, the questions only multiplied. Why was he in Adelaide? Why the hidden pocket? The erased identity? The Persian poetry? The code? The woman? The suitcase? And why did it all end with him sitting on a beach, alone, with the words, "It is finished," in his pocket? Even now, the mystery doesn't rest. It lingers. Not just because it's unsolved, but because it feels designed to remain so. Like someone planned every piece to outlast the people who'd try to solve it. In a world where we leave traces everywhere, in fingerprints, in data, in photographs and receipts, he left behind almost none. And perhaps, in that quiet December morning, that was the point. Maybe his story was never meant to be told, only found, wondered over, and then, like the man himself, lost again to the sea. Would you like me to continue with the next section? And so we return to that quiet morning, not through the eyes of the dead man, but through those who stumbled upon him. Strangers who came face to face with something that didn't make sense, something that didn't belong. The discovery wasn't cinematic. It wasn't even dramatic. It was ordinary in the way strange things often are at first. Almost forgettable. A couple walking along Somerton Beach saw what they thought was just another person resting against the seawall. He was sitting so neatly, legs extended and crossed at the ankles, his back propped comfortably against the stone. Nothing about him screamed alarm. In fact, had they not taken a closer look, they might have simply assumed he'd had a late night, maybe one too many drinks, and was now sleeping it off under the early morning sky. But still, something tugged at them. It was the stillness, perhaps. The kind that doesn't shift with breath or stir with dreams. The way his head slumped just a little too heavily to one side. Others had passed him earlier that morning and even the night before. A few remembered glancing at him. One man thought he had seen him raise an arm briefly, almost as if in a sluggish wave. Another had assumed he was alive, simply resting. Nobody thought to stop. Nobody thought to call for help. The man was dressed well. He wasn't causing trouble. And in that brief, human calculation we all make, he didn't seem like someone in need. It wasn't until later in the morning, when the same motionless figure remained in the same exact position, that someone finally went over. And by then, it was too late. Whatever had already happened. There had been no struggle, no frantic cries for help in the night, no signs of panic in the sand around him. Just a man whose story had ended silently, in public, and yet unnoticed. The police were called, and they too found themselves confronted not with a crime scene, but a puzzle. A man dressed in the calm of someone who expected to return home. His pockets turned up, no wallet, no keys, no identification of any kind. His face wasn't familiar to anyone. He had appeared without warning, and now he had vanished in plain sight. The first officers and witnesses spoke of how peaceful he looked, how untouched the scene was. No blood, no mess, just a stranger leaning gently against the wall, as though he'd chosen that very spot to disappear. And maybe he had, or maybe someone else had chosen it for him. But there he was, in the quiet heart of a city that didn't know his name, a riddle dropped on the sand with no explanation and no promise of an answer. The kind of scene that doesn't shout, but whispers. Whispers something you can't quite hear, just enough to make sure you'll never forget. Would you like to go on to the next chapter of the mystery? And so when the authorities took the body from the sand to the coroner's table, the man who had once looked merely asleep began to unravel into something far stranger. It was only then, under the harsh hospital light and the quiet hands of those examining him, that the true depth of his mystery came to the surface. He had been dressed with care, a neatly pressed suit, shoes polished, a crisp white shirt, but every single label on his clothing, from jacket to socks, had been meticulously removed. Not cut hastily, not ripped out, but carefully and completely, as though by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. There was no wallet, no hat, no money, no watch. Nothing to hint at who he was or where he came from. Whoever he had been in life, in death, he was meant to be no one. The body itself held small clues, none of them conclusive, all of them strange. His calves were particularly developed, tight, defined, as if he'd spent years as a dancer or a long-distance runner. Not something you'd usually notice, but when everything else is blank, even muscle becomes a kind of signature. His hands were smooth, no signs of manual labor. His fingers tapered, well kept. He was a man who hadn't worked with machines or earth or tools. But then, his dental structure puzzled the pathologist. Some teeth were missing entirely, congenitally absent, a rare condition. His ears, too, specifically the upper hollow of the ear, were oddly shaped. The kind of traits that don't mean much in a crowd but might stand out to someone who knew him. The autopsy only deepened the mystery. His stomach revealed the last meal. A pasty, a simple dinner, something unremarkable. But then the doctor found signs of internal bleeding, congestion in his organs, an enlarged spleen, all pointing toward the possibility of poisoning. Yet no trace of any known toxin was found in his blood. In 1948, toxicology had its limits, but still, this was unusual. If poison had ended this man's life, it was a type that vanished cleanly, leaving no trace behind, not even a shadow. And if it wasn't poison, then what was it? Natural causes seemed unlikely. Suicide seemed overly theatrical. Murder, possibly. But then why leave him posed so peacefully, with no marks, no violence, no identity? The more they looked, the more it felt like someone had gone to great lengths not just to erase who he was, but to do it quietly, efficiently, with a kind of professional detachment. The way the clothing labels were removed hinted at foresight. Not panic, not impulse, precision. Someone either wanted him to disappear, or he had wanted to disappear himself. Either way, he was a man shaped by effort. Effort to build a certain appearance, and effort to make sure that appearance told no story. But still, the body tells something. Even when stripped of name and belongings, it speaks. It speaks through the carefulness of his dress, the peculiarities of his build, the silence of his organs, and the secrets embedded in the very flesh. It tells you that this man mattered to someone, that somewhere he belonged to a life that had kept him fed, clothed, and perhaps deeply involved in things most people never see. And yet, there he lay, unclaimed and unremembered, the kind of man who shouldn't vanish without consequence. And yet, somehow he had. Shall we follow the trail a little further, and as investigators tried to pull meaning from a man who had been methodically emptied of clues, a new thread emerged, waiting patiently just a few blocks away at Adelaide railway station. It was there, in the unclaimed baggage room, that a brown suitcase had been sitting for days, quietly collecting dust, its handle worn, its keyhole locked. The tag had been removed, like everything else connected to the stranger on the beach. But through the timing of the deposit and the items inside, police came to believe this case belonged to the same man. One more piece of a puzzle with no corner pieces, no guiding image, just fragments in a box that felt deliberately shuffled. When the suitcase was finally opened, it didn't scream spycraft or danger. It didn't whisper wealth or wanderlust. It was, at first glance, almost domestic. A shaving kit, clean and used. Pairs of underwear, socks, a dressing gown. There was a screwdriver, a pair of scissors, and oddly enough, a stenciling brush. The kind used by clerks, draftsmen, or perhaps someone with military training. Some of the clothing bore the name T. Keene, stitched into linings. But that lead died fast. No one named Keene was missing. And those particular labels, unlike the rest, hadn't been removed, almost as if they were meant to mislead rather than reveal. That kind of detail doesn't happen by accident. It suggests a mind thinking not only in terms of disappearance, but of misdirection. All the tags from clothing and belongings, again, had been cut away with care. No manufacturing labels. No initials carved into the combs. Not even a monogram on the handkerchiefs. Nothing you could trace. And every object, no matter how ordinary, had the same quiet oddness about it. A sense that they'd been curated, stripped of context, packed not for comfort, but for purpose. But what that purpose was, nobody could say. And that's where the human weight of it starts to settle. Because behind every suitcase is a story. A man packs what he believes he might need, what he cannot leave behind. He chooses what he wants close. This man, whoever he was, had no photographs, no letters, no keepsakes. Nothing that tied him to a life, a memory, or another soul. And that emptiness is louder than any clue. It's the kind of silence that feels chosen, not the result of loss, but the product of erasure, systematic, intentional. And that raises the question no one could shake. Was he trying to disappear, or had someone made him disappear? Was this the trace of a man running from something, or the footprint of someone carefully buried in plain sight? Every item in that suitcase looked ordinary until you considered what was missing. And it's in that negative space, the space where a name, a past, a voice should be, that the mystery truly lives. We can follow it further still, if you're ready to see where the next step leads. But even as the suitcase revealed its stripped-down secrets, it was a far smaller detail, barely the size of a matchstick, that pulled this story into the realm of something poetic, unsettling, and perhaps final. Hidden deep inside the waistband of the dead man's trousers, stitched into a concealed pocket no one would have noticed without careful searching, was a tiny scrap of paper. A simple piece, cut cleanly, with just 2 words printed in elegant typeface. Taman Shud. Persian. Translated loosely, it means, "It is finished." Not a name, not a number, not a clue, in the conventional sense, but something that felt like a signature. Or maybe a farewell. It wasn't a phrase someone would scribble in passing. It carried the weight of conclusion, of something ended by choice or design. Investigators were baffled, but not idle. They pored over libraries, consulted translators, scholars, even antique dealers. And eventually, the trail circled back to a book, a rare edition of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a centuries-old Persian text known for its musings on mortality, fate, and the fleeting nature of life. The kind of book one might turn to in moments of great clarity or great sorrow. When that book finally turned up, it wasn't in a library or on a bookshelf. It was in the back seat of an abandoned car, left unlocked near the beach where the man had died. Someone, perhaps a passerby, had handed it in to police, unaware of its significance. Inside, the last page had been torn out. The shape of the tear matched the scrap of paper exactly. This was the source. This was the origin of those two final words. Taman Shud. Now imagine this not as a mere literary reference, but as a deeply human act. A man, in the last hours of his life, carrying with him a phrase clipped from a book of verse. A phrase that implies closure. Not panic, not fear, but finality. If he placed it there himself, then perhaps it was a message, quiet and deliberate, left behind like a whisper no one was meant to hear until long after he was gone. And if someone else placed it there, then it's not just strange, it's chilling. A eulogy written by someone who wanted the words, but not the voice that once spoke them. In either case, we are left with something far more haunting than a clue. We're left with the residue of intent. A man who walked into death carrying a poem in his pocket, stripped of identity, yet leaving behind a phrase that has echoed through time. Taman Shud. It is finished. But for the rest of us, trying to make sense of this shadow, it was anything but. Would you like to follow that book further? Because what it held inside might have been darker than poetry alone. But if the final words of the dead man were torn from a page, then that page had a past, and the book it belonged to still had more to say. When police examined the weathered copy of the Rubaiyat found in the abandoned car, they weren't expecting it to speak. And yet, nestled within its back pages, those same pages once thought to hold only poetry, were markings that had nothing to do with verse. Scribbled faintly in pencil, barely visible unless held against the right light, was a series of letters arranged in jagged lines, without clear words, without context. 5 lines in all, random to the eye, but deliberate in their order. Some letters were crossed out, others isolated. This wasn't idle doodling. It looked like a code. People would later argue over its nature. Some believed it to be a cipher, others a series of initials, or the remnants of a language known only to a few. Whatever it was carefully hidden and almost lost to time. The ink had nearly faded, as though trying to take the secret with it. Cryptographers tried to crack it. Intelligence agencies glanced at it. But the code held tight, offering no easy answers. And as eyes pored over the letters, the book revealed something else. A phone number. It was unlisted, local, and when they called it, it rang in the home of a nurse named Jessica Thompson. Now it's here that the story bends. Because Jessica, young, composed, with a quiet life in a suburb just minutes from the beach, denied knowing the man. She said she didn't recognize the name, didn't understand how her number came to be in the book. But when detectives showed her a plaster cast of the dead man's face, something shifted. She didn't faint, but her body stiffened. Her demeanor cracked just enough for those in the room to remember it for decades. She knew something, and whatever it was, it never passed her lips. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was a memory long buried that came back all at once. Jessica had once given a copy of the Rubaiyat to a man during the war. A gift of affection or comfort, as people do when facing the uncertainty of time and distance. She couldn't recall if it was the same edition. Couldn't, or wouldn't, confirm. The truth stayed behind her eyes. And what do you do with a connection like that? A number in a book, a nurse who won't say more, a code no one can solve. It's the kind of moment where real life tilts into the edges of fiction, where ordinary people suddenly find themselves tethered to something vast and quiet and maybe dangerous. A life lost, a life shaken, and between them, a book filled with poems and secrets. That book no longer belonged to literature. It had become something else entirely, a map that led nowhere, and yet felt like it should. Would you like to meet the woman behind the silence? Because Jessica's story, whether whispered or withheld, would only deepen the shadow. And just like that, the silence around Jessica Thompson became louder than words ever could. A name in a book, a tremble at the sight of a plaster face. These things alone might have faded with time. But the world was watching. And the world, especially in 1948, was wound tight with suspicion. The war was over, but not the fear. The Cold War had begun to simmer beneath diplomacy's surface, and in that kind of atmosphere, even the smallest thread could unravel into something much larger. Jessica, who had once been a nurse, was suddenly seen in a different light, cast not just as a woman with secrets, but maybe a keeper of something far more dangerous. Whispers started to float that she might have been involved in espionage, and not just because of the dead man. It was something else, something in her story that didn't quite hold its shape when held up to scrutiny. Something about her evasiveness, her reluctance, her sharp intelligence and fluency in Russian, which later came to light. That alone wasn't a crime, of course. But in that era, being fluent in Russian wasn't just a skill. It was a signal. And then there was her son. As time passed, people began to notice things, not rumors, but features. He had a peculiar ear shape, a rare anatomical quirk that only a tiny percentage of the population shared. That same trait had been observed on the dead man. Then came the dental structure, unusual, distinct, another rare match. Coincidence? Maybe. But when you're working with so few clues, those details begin to feel less like chance and more like whispers of something hidden. So the questions multiplied. The questions: was the unknown man the boy's father? Did Jessica love him once, long ago, in a time when people didn't talk about those things out loud? Or was it something colder? Something transactional? Strategic? The kind of connection that serves a mission more than a heart? If he was a spy, and she too was involved in something covert, then the silence makes sense. Because in the world of espionage, even love becomes a liability. We may never know the truth of what Jessica carried with her. She never admitted to knowing the man, not publicly, not to the authorities, and certainly not to history. But the look in her eyes, witnessed by detectives and etched into notes long since filed away, said otherwise. Sometimes what isn't said becomes the loudest legacy. And in this case, the silence of one woman left a question mark hanging in the air that not even decades of digging have been able to bring down. And from the silence left in Jessica's wake, the world did what it always does when the truth remains just out of reach. It speculated. Some people believe that when the facts run dry, imagination becomes a kind of justice, a way to fill the empty spaces left behind by lives we never understood. And the case of the Somerton man offered no shortage of such spaces. So the theories came, each one painting a different portrait of the man, each one trying to answer the same persistent question. Who was he? And why did he die so carefully? To many, the context alone felt like a whisper from a deeper game. It was the Cold War, a time when nothing could be taken at face value. Alliances were shifting, secrets were currency, and trust was rationed out like water in a desert. The body on the beach, dressed like a man of means yet stripped of every identifier, echoed the habits of espionage. No labels, no names, no origin. The coded letters found in the book didn't help quiet the theory either. They looked like gibberish to the average eye. But to someone trained in ciphers, they may have held instructions, names, or even confessions. Perhaps he was a courier, someone who knew too much, or worse, someone who failed in the one job spies are never allowed to get wrong: discretion. Then again, there are those who see heartbreak where others see hidden agendas. They imagine a man undone not by international politics, but by the raw, untraceable pain of love lost. Perhaps he came to Adelaide for her, or because of her. Maybe she turned him away, or never answered his call at all. A man without hope has no need for identity after all. The small scrap of poetry tucked in his clothing might not have been a signal, but a sigh. A final line in a chapter he couldn't bear to keep writing. It is finished. Not a message to others, but to himself. Some believe the poison, if it existed, was self-administered, a quiet escape. But even that story is hard to hold, because no trace of the poison was ever found. And poison that leaves no trace, well, that brings us right back to espionage. Then there's the theory that seems to live in the cracks between all the others, that he was a criminal, not a petty thief, but someone involved in darker trades. Smuggling, maybe. Forging documents. Moving goods or information that weren't meant to move. And someone, somewhere, decided he was a loose end. His suitcase, the strange tools, the stenciling brush. All of it could belong to someone living between borders. Someone whose life was defined by not being found. And if someone like that is killed, it wouldn't be loud. It would be quiet, professional, permanent. But still, it always comes back to the details. No signs of struggle, no wounds. Just a man sitting as if waiting for something, or someone, at the edge of the ocean. The code in the book has never been cracked, not truly. It remains a riddle within a riddle, perhaps meaningless, perhaps the key to everything. And maybe that's what keeps this story alive, all these years later. Not just the mystery of who he was, but the feeling that he knew something the rest of us didn't. That even in death, he carried a secret he never let go. And just when it seemed like time had dulled the case into legend, when memory had begun to polish the mystery smooth like a stone kept in a pocket too long, the ground was disturbed. In 2021, more than 70 years after he was buried under a plain stone and 100 whispered theories, the Somerton man was exhumed. Not to exploit him, but to listen, to see if, even in death, he might still have something left to say. And through the delicate science of DNA, it turned out he did. What they found wasn't certainty, not quite, but a name, Carl Webb, or Charles, as some records called him. An electrical engineer from Melbourne, a man with a profession, a history, a trail of documents and addresses stretching back through the static of forgotten years. It was a name that finally gave the faceless man a place in the world. But if the name was a beginning, it wasn't the end. Not even close. Because the moment they said his name out loud, the real questions echoed louder than ever. Why would a man like Charles Webb find himself in Adelaide with no one to greet him? No luggage that spoke his truth, no markings on his clothes, and no one willing to say they missed him. He wasn't listed as missing. His family, for reasons still unclear, never filed a report. No stories came forward, no tearful reunions, no long-lost letters. Just a record of a man who had once been there, and then, somehow, wasn't. The DNA pointed toward him, but didn't explain why he had a book with a missing final page, or why the very phrase Taman Shud had been sewn into his final moments, like the closing note of a song no one else could hear. It didn't explain the suitcase, or the coded letters, or Jessica Thompson. And it certainly didn't explain why a man with a quiet trade and an ordinary life left no ripples when he vanished, only shadows. So we are left once more where we began, with a man who sat down by the sea and never got back up, and a world still trying to understand why. The name may be Charles Webb, but the mystery, that remains untouched. And even with that name, Carl Webb, whispered into the long silence, the air around the story still feels heavy, as though the mystery itself has refused to surrender. The facts are more plentiful now than they were in 1948, but the heart of it, the part that makes you stop and wonder in the quiet hours of the night, remains as elusive as ever. Because this was never just about a man found lifeless on the sand. It's about how a person can step out of the flow of everyday life, leave no farewell, no explanation, and dissolve into questions. We live in a world now where a simple click or a casual message leaves behind a trail of digital breadcrumbs, search histories, GPS pings, social media echoes that linger long after we've closed the screen. And yet, decades before this digital net could ever be cast, this man managed to slip through every grasping hand. He didn't just die anonymously. He lived in a way that made anonymity seem almost deliberate, as if he folded himself into the fabric of the world with the intent of vanishing, one thread among billions. There's something haunting in that, something that reaches beyond espionage or romance or misfortune, something that touches a deeper nerve, the human fear of being forgotten, and the quieter fear of choosing to be. What really happened on that beach may forever remain between the waves and the man who watched them one last time. And maybe that's the final truth of the Somerton Man. Not the name he bore, but the mystery he left behind, still lingering in the salt air, whispering to anyone who dares to wonder how a man can disappear in plain sight and take his story with him. There's a book. No one can read it. No one knows who wrote it. It's filled with plants that don't exist and words that don't belong to any known language. Naturally, we're obsessed. What is the Voynich Manuscript, and why has it defeated every genius thrown at it? You see, there's something in us, something ancient, maybe even a little irrational, that cannot let a mystery sit still. We prod at it, we decode, we translate, we rebuild. And when something refuses to yield, when it stares back at us across centuries with the same indecipherable silence, we lean in closer. That's what the Voynich Manuscript does. It sits there like a riddle that forgot to include a question mark, challenging our deepest need to make sense of things. It is not just unreadable, it is confidently, unapologetically unreadable. And the fact that we've thrown everything at it, codebreakers from world wars, modern AI with more processing power than any human mind, linguists fluent in dead tongues, and still come up empty, well, that makes it even harder to walk away. Imagine holding something in your hands that is clearly trying to say something. Its pages filled edge to edge with careful ink strokes, symbols arranged with all the precision of meaning, but without the gift of comprehension. It's not chaotic, it's meticulous. There's structure, rhythm, repetition. The letters, if we can call them that, repeat in patterns like language should. The pages are organized, not scrawled. Whoever wrote it with purpose. That's what makes it all the more maddening. This isn't a mess of symbols dumped on a page for the sake of art or play. It looks like something meant to be read, but it never reveals how. It's like trying to listen to music when your ears can't hear the notes, or trying to understand a dream someone else had, painted in your room but locked in another mind. And the thing is, the manuscript doesn't just whisper this mystery. It flaunts it. Its plants are like sketches from another world, familiar in shape but biologically impossible. Roots twist into strange knots. Leaves curl in forms no botanist can classify. Some diagrams seem to show constellations, others naked women suspended in tubes, bathed in green fluid like alchemical experiments or the imaginings of a feverish mind. The effect isn't simply confusion. It's a feeling, a creeping sense that whatever this book was meant for, it belonged to a mind that didn't think like ours. Not entirely. This is why it draws people in. Not just the curious, but the devoted. Not just hobbyists, but professionals who've built careers on cracking impossible codes. And all of them, without exception, have walked away defeated. Or worse, they stayed, forever circling, convinced the solution is only just out of reach. The manuscript becomes an obsession, a mirror that reflects more about our need to understand than it does about its own nature. It's the kind of thing that makes you wonder if mystery itself is the point, if not knowing was always the intent. Some people say it must be a hoax, but that raises an even stranger question. Who could sustain such an elaborate deception? Writing out hundreds of pages of fake script that obeys statistical rules more consistent than many real languages, sketching an entire imagined world without breaking its internal logic even once. We live in an age where almost nothing is truly hidden anymore. Secrets leak, databases get cracked, ancient languages are reconstructed by comparing patterns and roots across time. And yet here is this one stubborn artifact, sitting quietly in a glass case at Yale University's Beinecke Library, defying us with every page. It has become more than a manuscript. It's a symbol, a reminder that even now, some things refuse to be known. And in that refusal, they challenge something deeper in us than mere curiosity. They remind us that understanding isn't a right, it's a gift. And sometimes the universe withholds it, not out of malice, but mystery. Do you think the book was ever meant to be read? Or maybe, just maybe, it was always meant to be exactly what it is, a riddle that doesn't solve, a question that echoes without an answer. Maybe it's laughing at us, somewhere in the space between meaning and madness. The Voynich Manuscript hasn't spoken in 600 years. Maybe it never will. Maybe that's the point. And so, if the Voynich Manuscript was never meant to be read, then what exactly does it show us? Because make no mistake, this thing shows. It spills out across its 240 vellum pages in ink and color, like the inside of someone's private universe. A place where logic is familiar, yet everything still feels out of place, like walking through a dream where you know it's your house, but the furniture keeps shifting when you look away. It isn't just that the book is unreadable, it's that even what we can see makes no sense, yet is too carefully drawn to dismiss. The contents are strange, not simply random, but organized into sections that echo the structure of knowledge as it once was imagined. If this is a hoax, it's one with a filing system. You open it, and first you're met with what scholars have called the botanical section. Hundreds of illustrations of plants, but not ones you or I have ever seen growing in the ground. Their roots curl into impossible spirals. Their leaves fork in unnatural symmetry. Their flowers bloom in ways that seem biologically inconsistent. And yet, they look like plants. They are drawn with the same confidence and detail you'd find in a medieval herbal, a book meant to teach healers which herbs to pick, how to use them. It's as if the author believed in these specimens entirely, perhaps even plucked them from gardens that existed only in his mind. And surrounding these sketches are columns of script, likely descriptions or instructions, though we can't say for sure. We see the form of knowledge without the knowledge itself. Then the stars begin. The astronomical section arrives like a pivot into the sky. Circles upon circles filled with symbols that suggest constellations, but none that align with the ones we know. There are zodiac signs, but they're drawn with such odd configurations that they lead us nowhere. The sun, the moon, the stars, all arranged in a geometry that promises navigation but denies direction. It's like someone tried to chart the cosmos with a compass that only worked in dreams. There are diagrams here that look like astrolabes, star wheels, maybe even calendars, but each time someone tries to ground them in known science, they vanish into abstraction, like chasing starlight in a fog. And then, suddenly, the human form emerges, not in sacred poses or noble portraits, but in the strangest of settings. The biological section, if we can call it that, is perhaps the most haunting. Page after page of naked women, always drawn in the same style, almost childlike in line work, expressionless, draped in bathtubs, pipes, or pools of greenish fluid. Some are connected by flowing lines, as if water, or something else, runs between them. They stand beneath celestial wheels, drift through odd mechanisms, or sit within what look like wombs or chambers. It feels ritualistic, or surgical, or both. There's no clear violence, but there's no comfort either. These aren't scenes of daily life or myth. They are more like fragments from a fever, recurring images in someone's private mythology. If this is science, it is cloaked in symbols too personal to decode. Next come the jars, the clusters of herbs, the containers stacked like apothecary shelves, as though the book was trying to be a pharmaceutical guide. But again, the contents defy recognition. The herbs don't resemble known species, the jars are unlabeled except for lines of Voyniches, and the diagrams connect parts of plants in ways that make no medical sense. Still, the layout mimics the structure of real medieval medical texts. There's a logic in the way things are grouped, cataloged. The creator clearly understood the performance of knowledge, even if the knowledge itself was invented. If someone wrote a fantasy encyclopedia while on medieval cough syrup, this would be it. Eerily complete, unshakably consistent, and completely divorced from the real. And at the end, or scattered throughout depending on how you number the pages, comes the most cryptic portion of all. Just dense, unbroken text. No illustrations, no figures, just long pages of paragraphs in the same looping alien script. They stretch on, uniform and tireless, like someone recording a history only they could remember. And what's strange is that the writing maintains statistical patterns. Certain words repeat. Sentence lengths follow rhythms, spacing is deliberate. It has all the traits of real language, but the substance dissolves in your hands. It's like reading someone else's memory of a story you were never told. When people say the manuscript feels like a fever dream, this is what they mean. You can't quite call it nonsense, because it behaves too much like sense. And you can't quite call it sense, because every interpretation collapses. It drifts between categories, teasing familiarity, never landing anywhere solid. And that's what gives it its power. Not just the mystery of the symbols, but the strange familiarity of its structure. We see in it the mirror of our own systems: taxonomy, astrology, medicine, narrative, but warped, like a reflection in rippling water. It doesn't just hide meaning. It imitates meaning so well that we can't help but feel it's just out of reach. You begin to wonder if this book is some kind of map, not to a place, but to a mind, a mind that once saw the world very differently, or perhaps couldn't see it at all in the way we do. Was it genius? Madness? Ritual? Hoax? Or something else entirely? And maybe the pages don't hold answers. Maybe they were never written for us. Maybe they weren't even written to be read. And once you've stared long enough into the pages, you begin to notice something deeper. Beyond the drawings, beyond the themes, beneath even the structure of the book itself, there is the script, written in a hand so steady, so deliberate, that you can almost hear the sound of the quill scratching across vellum if you close your eyes. The letters, looping and lean, seem to form words. Those words stretch into lines, and the lines curl across the page with the quiet rhythm of a mind that, at least to itself, knew exactly what it was doing. It looks like writing. It flows like writing. But it doesn't act like any language we've ever known. No punctuation, no capital letters, just an uninterrupted stream of glyphs, some that repeat with unsettling frequency, others that seem to cluster like syllables but never quite form anything we recognize. A paragraph might contain the same word 5 or 6 times, back to back, as if someone typed apple, 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 and tried to convince you it meant something profound. And yet, it's not random. It's too consistent. Linguists have spent lifetimes trying to wrap their minds around this so-called language, which we now call Voynich, named after the man who rediscovered the manuscript. Cryptographers who cracked Nazi codes and Cold War ciphers have thrown their tools at it, only to come away with silence. Some of the sharpest computational minds in modern AI have fed the script into their algorithms, hoping that pattern recognition, frequency analysis, or neural modeling would finally shake loose the secret. But nothing. Not a syllable. Not a hint of meaning. The structure is there, the repetition, the predictable sequences, the spacing that mimics natural language. But the message, if there is one, remains sealed. And that's what makes it maddening. If this is a hoax, it's the most consistent nonsense ever written, because hoaxes usually crack. You can trace a forger's hand eventually. Their confidence slips, their symbols contradict, their logic breaks down. But the Voynich script doesn't break. It behaves like a language. It has patterns and internal rules. Certain glyphs tend to appear only at the beginning of words, others always at the end. There are clusters that show up in specific contexts, like the labels in the plant drawings or the diagrams of stars, almost as if there's a grammar hiding just beneath the surface. But if that grammar exists, it is one that has no ties to any human tongue we've ever spoken, no historical language family, no bridge to any known alphabet. It may as well have been born from a world that never touched ours, and that's the part that pulls you in. Because someone wrote this, not a machine, not a trickster in a single burst of nonsense. A human being, with human hands, sat down and spent what must have been years, decades perhaps, pouring this ink onto parchment with care, with rhythm, and with purpose. The letters aren't scrawled in haste. They're careful, practiced, sometimes beautiful. That tells you something. Either this person believed they were recording something real, or they were crafting a lie so enormous, so meticulous, that its falsehood became indistinguishable from truth. Either way, you're left with a strange and haunting artifact. Not just a puzzle, but a mirror. One that reflects our need to understand, to translate, to categorize. And in failing to do so, it reminds us of the limits of those instincts. You can't help but wonder if maybe the real message was never in the words themselves, but in the act of writing. A kind of ritual, a code for one. A private mythology that never asked to be shared. And here we are, 500 years later, still trying to make sense of what may have never been meant to make sense at all. And long before we argued over the patterns and the strange silent words of the Voynich script, before the code breakers and the AI and the theories that came like waves against stone, there was a man walking through the quiet halls of a Jesuit college in Italy. It was the year 1912, and Wilfred Voynich, a Polish-born rare book dealer with an eye for the unusual, had made a habit of visiting forgotten libraries tucked in corners of Europe, looking for treasure in the form of old parchment and dust-covered tomes. He was no stranger to the odd and obscure, but nothing prepared him for what he would find behind those monastery walls. It was a book, bound in aged covers, its pages yellowed but surprisingly intact, made not of paper but vellum, animal skin, carefully prepared centuries earlier. The moment he touched it, something about it felt off, like a voice speaking a language you don't know but still understand to be urgent. The manuscript was unlike anything he had ever handled. No title, no author. Its pages were filled with symbols that resembled writing, but not any writing found in Latin, Greek, Arabic, or Hebrew. They weren't just unfamiliar, they were unplaceable. And then there were the illustrations. Page after page of impossibilities, plants that didn't match any known species, stars arranged in constellations that pointed to nowhere, and diagrams filled with round naked women submerged in strange pools of green liquid, twisting through spirals and tubes like they were part of some forgotten rite or impossible anatomy lesson. Even Wilfred, who made his living in the world of rare and strange books, couldn't make sense of what he was looking at. But he knew one thing with perfect clarity. This wasn't just unusual. It was wrong, in a way that invited obsession. And once the book had a name, Voynich, taken from the man who brought it into modern light, the questions began to echo louder than ever. Who wrote this? And why? Over the years, names have been proposed like suspects in a mystery without a crime. One of the earliest candidates was Roger Bacon, the 13th century English friar who dabbled in optics, alchemy, and early experimental science. He had the mind for it, and the timing seemed to line up. Barely. His reputation as a brilliant and slightly dangerous thinker made him an attractive origin point, but the connection was circumstantial, like a shadow mistaken for a man. Then, of course, came Leonardo da Vinci. Because when something strange and clever shows up in history, Leonardo's name is never far behind. He fits every profile: artist, anatomist, inventor, writer of backward scripts. But the Voynich manuscript doesn't feel like da Vinci. It lacks his flair, his mischief, his unmistakable fingerprint. Besides, the vellum has been carbon dated to the early 1400s, decades before Leonardo was even born. And while some would bend time to keep him in the story, most scholars have come to accept that, this time, the mystery didn't begin with him. Others have imagined a solitary genius, someone unknown to history, working in silence, building a world from ink and imagination. Maybe they were a scholar cast out, or a mystic convinced they were transcribing divine knowledge. Or maybe, just maybe, they were simply bored, trapped in a cold stone room with a lifetime of vellum and a mind that didn't want to stay quiet. There's something deeply human about that possibility. Not a prophet or a hoaxer, but someone writing only for themselves, following thoughts too strange to share, leaving behind a book that might have never been meant to be found. And then, as always, the outliers come in. Voices that whisper of things not from this world. Aliens, time travelers, interdimensional scribes. Depending on who you ask, the book might have arrived here by accident or design. And while it's easy to laugh, it's also true that none of the terrestrial theories have fully held up. The ink has been dated, the pages tested, yet the language resists explanation. And for every expert who insists it must be nonsense, another points to the structure and says, then why does it behave like a language? That's where the hoax theory begins to crumble. For someone to create something so large, so consistent, and so resistant to randomness, they would need not just patience, but intention. Nonsense rarely plays by rules. But this book does. Its patterns repeat in ways that resemble logic, even if we can't unlock it. So if this is a lie, it's a lie so perfectly crafted that it looks like a language even under the harshest lights of science, history, and technology. And you start to wonder if the point was never to be read at all, but to be found. puzzled over, argued about. Maybe the very act of not understanding it is what the writer wanted to preserve, like a trap built from mystery, spring-loaded with curiosity, waiting centuries for someone to fall in. And fall in, we did. And so the centuries passed, and the Voynich Manuscript slipped through the hands of scholars, mystics, and hopeful dreamers, like water through a closed fist. But then came a time when the world was less about monasteries and parchment, and more about machines and war. During World War II, some of the most brilliant minds ever assembled were brought together not to decode an old book, but to win a war through broken ciphers and intercepted messages. These were men and women who cracked the Enigma machine, who turned the tide of history with silence and symbols. And yet, when this strange little manuscript was placed before them, they looked at its looping glyphs and careful pages, and gave up. Not because they were lazy, or because they couldn't have tried harder, but because the more they stared at it, the more it seemed like a joke written in the handwriting of a ghost. Fast forward to our present day, where machines dream in patterns and algorithms complete your sentences before you think them. You can ask a voice assistant to play your favorite song or deepfake a politician into saying whatever foolish thing you'd like. We live in a time where AI can generate photorealistic images of things that don't exist, mimic any voice with eerie precision, and write essays better than some humans care to attempt. And yet, in a world where artificial intelligence can map your face and recommend your next 5 purchases before you know you want them, it still can't read this cursed book. It tries, of course. It looks at patterns and frequencies, counts letter repetitions and word clusters, and proudly hands you its findings. Sentences that sound like someone dreaming in another language while underwater. Some outputs are absurd, some eerily poetic, and some downright hilarious, as though the AI, in its frustration, decided to amuse itself. The book resists logic like a cat resists water. You can force it in, but it will fight you the entire way. And so we're left with a question that's less about translation and more about identity. What is this book? Is it a language, shaped by hands and minds we no longer understand? Or is it not a language at all, but the illusion of one? A script meant to tease the brain into thinking it means something? Some say it's a constructed language, an early experiment in linguistic invention. Others suggest it might be a natural language that no longer exists, spoken by a people who vanished before they could leave more behind. And then, there are the darker theories, that it was written by someone unwell, someone whose mind saw patterns where there were none, and laid them down in ink with devotion and madness in equal measure. A work of art, yes, but art born from a fractured mind trying to make order out of chaos. There's a quiet theory, too, that lingers like a whisper. What if the book wasn't meant to be understood at all? What if it's a mnemonic device, a memory palace disguised as a book, a system built not to speak to others, but to trigger the memory of one person alone? In that light, every word might mean something, but only to its author. The shapes might carry the rhythm of a ritual, or the echo of a formula, never meant to be read in the way we understand reading. That would explain the repetition, the internal consistency, and the strange order that somehow feels deliberate. It would also explain why no code breaker, scholar, or machine has succeeded. Because the book is a mirror, not a map. It doesn't lead you somewhere. It keeps you exactly where you are, wondering. Some days, it feels like a puzzle. Other days, like a prank played across time. But most days, it just feels like a question that refuses to be answered. A message from someone who might have known that even the act of trying to understand something impossible has value of its own. And that, maybe, is the true meaning buried in its pages. Not a translation, but a reminder that some things aren't puzzles to be solved. They're mysteries to live with. And as we sit with that mystery, as it quietly hums in the background of every theory we've ever tried, our eyes drift back to the pages themselves. Not the words, not this language that may or may not be a language, but to the strange, quiet patterns that emerge when you stop trying to read and just begin to observe. There's something unnerving about the way certain letter clusters repeat, almost like musical motifs in a symphony that never resolves, echoing across the pages with such regularity that one starts to feel they mean something. Perhaps not in the way we think of meaning, but in the way a heartbeat carries a rhythm even when it's not understood. The same odd shapes appear again and again in ways too deliberate to be random, yet too elusive to pin down as rule-bound. And then there's the formatting, which seems to know what it wants even when we don't. Paragraphs are spaced with a kind of calm confidence, as if the writer believed completely in what they were doing. Some pages are structured like recipes, others like diagrams from some forgotten science. Words flow along curves, spiral around drawings, bend to fit the contours of circular charts and impossible maps, almost like the text is dancing around invisible instructions known only to the hand that wrote them. It's not chaos. It's not careless. It's something that follows its own inner law, strange and unbreakable. The kind of law that doesn't ask to be understood, only obeyed. Then there's the material. The manuscript isn't paper. It's vellum, goatskin, prepared with the kind of care that only centuries of tradition can teach. The texture holds the ink differently. It breathes. You can almost feel the weight of time in its surface, the way each page holds a quiet crackle of history. The ink has faded, but not completely. There are greens and reds, soft blues and inky browns that haven't entirely surrendered to the years. Some colors are brushed on with a kind of childlike honesty, as though the artist, if we can call them that, was more interested in the act than the outcome. The illustrations aren't polished, but they're not clumsy either. They sit in a strange place between art and instruction, like sketches meant to be understood in ritual, not in reason. It all gives the unsettling impression that we're looking at something with purpose, even if the purpose is long gone. Some believe it might be medical in nature, an alchemist's attempt to map the workings of body and spirit in a time when the line between healing and sorcery was thin and wavering. Others suggest it was part of a ritual practice, something meant to be used rather than read, performed rather than studied, the way a chant is repeated for its rhythm rather than its words. But perhaps the strangest possibility is the one we least want to consider. That all of this detail, all of this order, came from someone not well, that it is the result of a mind caught in a loop, drawing meaning from shapes only it could recognize, writing again and again the same beautiful nonsense because it had to. And yet, even in that scenario, there is something deeply human about it. Because behind every repeated glyph, every careful brush of color, every spiral of text around a star that doesn't exist, there is a hand, a pulse, a person. Someone who believed enough in what they were doing to spend untold hours creating something the world still stares at in awe and confusion. Whether it was a ritual, a treatment, a diary, or a dream, it was real to them. And now, whether we understand it or not, it has become real to us. A mirror of our own need to find patterns in chaos, and our strange, stubborn hope that every mystery, no matter how strange, must eventually make sense. And as you let that image settle, the ink, the vellum, the weight of something made by hands now turn to dust, it's only natural to ask why we keep returning to it. Why, after all these years, this strange little manuscript continues to pull at the minds of scholars, dreamers, cryptographers, and storytellers like a riddle whispered just out of reach. There's something almost romantic in that pull, a quiet gravity that doesn't scream for attention but never quite lets you go. It isn't just curiosity. It's the kind of obsession that finds its way into the quiet hours of a person's life, when the rest of the world has gone still and your mind can afford to wander places it probably shouldn't. People have spent years, some, their entire careers, trying to make sense of it. Perfectly rational minds that once stood grounded in linguistics or logic, slowly bending toward a manuscript that refuses to meet them halfway. And in that surrender, there's something strangely beautiful. Because this isn't like chasing a murder mystery or a buried treasure. There's no promise of gold at the end, no guarantee of closure, no certainty that any of it was ever meant to be solved. But still, they try. The manuscript becomes a personal mirror, a private Everest, a kind of intellectual haunting that doesn't let go even when you walk away. Some walk into it with confidence, armed with codes and computers and centuries of textual knowledge, only to come out the other side humbled, almost reverent. They go in expecting to outsmart it and leave quietly nodding to the strange idea that perhaps it's not meant to be outsmarted at all. And that's the thing. The Voynich Manuscript isn't just a puzzle. It's a symbol now, of the unknowable, the unreachable, the unsolvable. It's a challenge that doesn't fight back, but still manages to win. like a jigsaw puzzle without corner pieces. No straight lines to guide you. No picture on the box to show what it's supposed to be. You start working on it because you want answers, but you keep working on it because something in your bones can't accept that the answer might not exist. Or worse, that it does, but we've forgotten how to see it. Maybe that's why it haunts people. Because deep down, it reminds us of everything we don't understand. Not just about this book, but about history, about communication, about ourselves. We look at its pages and see a version of ourselves reflected in the symbols, wanting desperately to make sense of something, and utterly alone in the attempt. It doesn't offer answers. It offers the space to wonder, to imagine, to wrestle with mystery without the safety net of resolution. And in a world that grows louder every day with answers, quick takes, and definitive statements, perhaps it's the quiet refusal of the Voynich Manuscript to give up its secrets that makes it feel, oddly enough, more alive than ever. And from that quiet space of wonder, we now find ourselves in the digital age, where the tools are sharper, the minds more interconnected, and the desire to finally pin down this slippery enigma is as relentless as ever. The manuscript, once locked away in obscurity, now resides in high-resolution clarity thanks to the Yale Botanical Rare Book and Manuscript Library. Every curling glyph, every faded line of ink, every botanical oddity and circular chart, scanned, digitized, and made available to anyone with a screen and an appetite for the arcane. It's almost poetic, really. For centuries, the book was the domain of cloistered scholars and secretive collectors, but now it floats freely in cyberspace, open to the world, and yet, still no closer to revealing its truth. Modern minds have thrown themselves at it with enthusiasm that borders on religious fervor. Some claim progress. Word frequency analyses have shown patterns. Certain glyphs repeat with strange regularity, and some sections seem more rigidly structured than others. Statistical studies hint at rules, at rhythms that feel linguistic, even if they don't align with any known tongue. There have even been attempts at partial decoding, matching similar words in similar diagrams, guessing at what a label might be, speculating wildly, hoping for a breakthrough. But still, like a house built on fog, none of it holds for long. It always slips. It always bends out of shape just when you think you've caught it. In a time when machines can mimic a human voice down to the breath, when neural networks can paint like masters and simulate personalities, the fact that no artificial intelligence, not even the brightest of them, can explain this book is both humbling and quietly thrilling. In a world where we can fake a politician's voice with eerie accuracy, we still can't read this cursed book. And yet that failure hasn't dimmed the manuscript's light. It's only made it glow a little brighter in the cultural imagination. Because the moment a mystery survives the crush of logic, it becomes something more. It becomes a story we all participate in. It's shown up in novels, its pages woven into the plots of thrillers and historical fiction alike. It's whispered through the subtext of video games, surfacing as a hidden object or the cipher that unlocks a deeper layer of lore. Conspiracy theories circle it like moths to flame. Some say it's alien, others think it's ancient, lost knowledge, and still others see it as a clever joke that history never quite laughed at. Documentaries have been made, podcasts obsessed, Reddit threads have grown like vines around it, every one of them reaching in hopes of touching something solid. But perhaps the most haunting idea of all is this, that it might be a piece of performance art, an elaborate creation with no intended meaning beyond the act of creation itself. Imagine someone centuries ago deciding to pour their time, their ink, their soul into something that looked important but said nothing, just to see what would happen. And now, hundreds of years later, we're still talking about it, still studying it, still turning its pages as though they might blink and speak. If that was the goal, then the artists succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Because here we are, in an age when almost nothing stays mysterious for long, and this little book, this stubborn, beautiful riddle, remains untouched at its core. Not solved, not forgotten, just waiting. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what it was always meant to do. And from the echo of all those theories and false starts, we arrive at something quieter. Something less like a mystery to be solved and more like a presence to be acknowledged. You can analyze patterns and run algorithms. You can scan every curve of every letter, hoping to glimpse the flicker of intention behind the ink. But at some point, If you're honest with yourself, you begin to feel something deeper pulling at the edges. A thought you might not want to say out loud. What if it was never meant to be read? What if the very structure of meaning, the idea that every symbol must translate into something you can understand, is the illusion that in our rush to decode, we're the ones inventing purpose just to silence the unease of not knowing? Because that's what humans do. We dig, we translate, we extrapolate. We tie strings from one dot to another, because letting the dots float free is just too much to bear. But what if the manuscript was written with no audience in mind, no key, no legend, just a mind mapping itself in symbols that felt true in the moment and were never meant to make sense to anyone else? Maybe it was a private ritual, a quiet rebellion against the rules of language, a secret language between a person and their own thoughts. Or perhaps it was simply an act of creation, pure, strange, and beautiful for its own sake, needing no interpretation to justify its existence. And then there's the uncomfortable idea we all keep in the back room of our minds. What if it's laughing at us? Not maliciously, but softly, like an old ghost watching a room full of people trying to fix a clock that was never broken. What if the book is fine just as it is, and we're the ones who keep projecting complexity where there is none, meaning where there's only pattern? And even that pattern might not be designed, just habit dressed in symmetry. Some mysteries aren't puzzles. Some are mirrors. So maybe that's why the Voynich Manuscript lingers in our thoughts, not because of what it says, but because of what it refuses to say. It sits there in its old goatskin body, quietly defiant, still keeping its secrets after all these centuries. And maybe that silence isn't a flaw. Maybe it's a message. Not everything that looks like a riddle has to be solved. Not every question needs an answer. The Voynich Manuscript hasn't spoken in 600 years. Maybe it never will. Maybe that's the point.